Welcome to the empty boat. You didn't arrive here by accident. Somewhere in the folds of time, perhaps between a sigh and a silence, your heart whispered that it was tired. Tired of running, tired of holding on, tired of being told it must. Become more, feel less, and keep going no matter the weight it carries. But here you may rest. This is not a place of noise, not a place of answers either. It is a place of noticing, of gently watching your breath return to you like a long-lost friend, of remembering that healing begins not by fixing what is broken, but by sitting with what aches in this space. Stories are not entertainment, they are invitations. Each tale you'll hear is a doorway into yourself, a mirror reflecting both shadow and light, a whisper from the stillness reminding you of something ancient yet never lost. So I invite you to close your eyes if it feels safe, to slow your breathing like leaves settling after the wind, and to journey with me into the quiet, into the questions, into 25 Zen stories whispered for the modern soul. This is the empty boat, and right now you are exactly where you need to be. Let us begin. Story 1. The river that doesn't rush, letting go of control. The mountain did not speak, yet it said everything. It stood in stillness, cradled by the morning mist, while a soft silver thread of river slipped past its feet. The villagers said this: river had no name, for it could not be tamed. Some days it murmured gently like a lullaby, other days it raged like a beast. It listened to no man, followed no order, and yet it always returned. That was enough for them. Not far from the rivers bend sat a weathered tea-house, walls of earth, roof of moss, windows cracked but open to the world. There, beneath a crooked cherry tree that hadn't bloomed in 7 springs, sat Master Aja, whose silence was deeper than sermons, whose presence made time soften its grip. He was steeped in years, draped in robes the color of faded clay, and his hands, though worn, held a stillness that could quiet even the most restless heart. On the 22nd day of autumn, as golden leaves fluttered like regrets from the trees, a young man named Tetsuya arrived. His steps were fast, as though chasing something, or perhaps being chased. His eyes were lined with sleepless nights and decisions too heavy for one lifetime. In his hand he clutched a phone, but it had no signal here. Nothing digital survived long near the river that didn't rush. He bowed awkwardly to Io and sat down, uninvited but not unwelcome. I heard you. Help people, Tetsuya said, his voice tight. I don't want Zen riddles or ancient proverbs. I just need answers. My company's collapsing. My fiancé left last week. I'm losing everything. I've done everything right, planned it all, but nothing obeys me anymore. Ao didn't respond at once. He poured tea instead, his movements slow, as though each gesture was a conversation with the moment. Do you know the story of the young monk and the dying fields? Ao finally asked. Tetsuya sighed, shoulders stiff. No, but I assume you're going to tell me. And so the master did. There was once a novice monk assigned to care for a rice field that had withered under the summer sun. He was earnest, zealous even, believing that effort could conquer all. He spent his days digging trenches, redirecting water, building tiny dams with stones and wood. But the water never obeyed. It flooded when he needed it calm. It vanished when he begged it to stay. His hands blistered, his mind frayed. He fasted, he prayed. He even scolded the river like a stubborn mule. One evening, exhausted, he slumped by the bank and wept. An old monk passed by and sat beside him. "Why do you war with the water?" the elder asked. "I must make it serve me," the young monk replied. "The rice will die." The elder looked at the river, which continued flowing, indifferent to the pain beside it. "Water doesn't serve," he said gently. "It flows. Your task is not to command it, but to learn its rhythm, align with it, and it may nourish. Fight it, and you both suffer." So the young monk did something he had never tried. He listened, not with ears, but with humility. He studied the curves of the land, the direction of wind, the timing of dew. He dug new channels, not from force, but from understanding. And the river came, not because it was made to, but because it was welcomed. Tetsuya looked down at his tea, its surface still as the old monk's eyes. "You're saying I'm trying?" "Too hard, I'm saying," Ayo answered. "You are confusing control with wisdom." Tetsuya scoffed, though not unkindly. "Easy for you to say. You don't live in the world, I do. Deadlines, investors, clients, competition. If I don't take control, I drown." Ayo pointed toward the crooked cherry tree above them. "It has not bloomed in 7 years. I could cut its branches, dig up its roots, force fertilizer into its veins, and perhaps it would bloom. But at what cost? The petals would not be real. The tree would no longer be a tree, but my puppet." He turned, his gaze back to Tetsuya. "What if the lesson is not how to force the bloom, but how to wait without despair?" The river gurgled nearby, as if nodding. Tetsuya's voice softened. "But what if everything falls apart while I wait?" Ayo nodded. "Then perhaps it was never yours to hold together." There was silence between them, not empty, but full of things unsaid. The wind moved. A leaf fell. Somewhere, a bird called out and was answered. "Tell me," Ayo said, "why must you control so much?" Tetsuya hesitated, then answered with surprising honesty. "Because if I don't feel safe. If I lose control, I feel like I'll disappear." Ayo nodded. "Ah, there it is." He closed his eyes for a moment. The need to control is often the wound of abandonment. Somewhere, long ago, something or someone convinced you that the world won't hold you unless you grip it tightly. He opened his eyes again. But control is a poor substitute for trust. It creates the illusion of safety while making you a prisoner of your own expectations. Tetsuya said nothing, but a small crack formed in the wall he had carried. Ayo continued, "Softer now. You are like a man clutching a flame, wondering why it burns. Let go, and your hands may finally heal." They sat for a while longer, watching. The sky melt from amber to blue-gray. The world was changing, and it did not ask for permission. Tetsuya stood slowly. "If I let go, what's left of me?" Ayo smiled. "Everything that was real." As the young man walked away, the crooked cherry tree stirred in the wind. A single blossom teeny tentative opened, and the river, as always, flowed, not rushed, not commanded, just free, letting go, always, of what it no longer needed to carry. Story 2. The cup that poured itself responding versus reacting in. The hush between twilight and true night. There is a silence so complete that it presses against the skin like mist. The hills had turned the color of charcoal, and lanterns glowed, like warm fireflies along the winding paths of the village. Crickets rehearsed their nightly chorus beneath the wooden eaves of the temple, while inside, the air held the faint aroma of sandalwood and old paper. Master Ayo sat cross-legged by the old brazier, a kettle resting on its gentle flame. He was alone, save for the sound of breath and the occasional crackle of ash. The teacups before him, small, ceramic, weathered by time, stood, empty but expectant, like questions without answers. The door slid open, and in stepped a woman. Her robes were fine but disheveled. Her hair, pinned high, had begun to loosen with the urgency of her stride. She bowed quickly, too quickly, and sat across from him, not waiting for a word. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," she said, her voice clipped and quivering with restraint. "I just... I needed to speak with someone who doesn't try to fix me." Ao offered her tea. She shook her head. "I'm not calm enough for tea." Ao poured anyway. The steam rose between them, blurring the space like memory. "My name is Suri," she said after a pause. "I teach literature at the university, or at least I used to. I don't know anymore. My life feels like it's happening in sharp flashes, emails, arguments, breaking news, alarms, judgments, messages. Everything demands something from me." She looked up at him, eyes fierce but hollow. "And I find myself reacting all the time to everything. My students complain, my family calls, my partner forgets my boundaries, and I feel like I have to respond instantly, emotionally, loudly, or be ignored. The world is too fast. If I don't scream, I disappear." Ao said nothing. He took her teacup and tipped it slightly. A single drop spilled onto the table. "Water," he said, "always finds its way. But boiling water, poured without care, burns." Sayori watched the drop spread into the wood grain, a dark circle slowly fading. "You are not wrong to feel," Ao continued. "You are not wrong to care. But reactions are not the same as responses. One is a spark, the other a lantern. One consumes, the other reveals." She lowered her gaze, her jaw tight. "I don't want to be reactive. But when someone hurts me, when they speak unfairly, I feel the fire climb into my throat. If I hold it in, I feel like I'll collapse. If I let it out, I destroy everything. I don't know how to be calm without being invisible." Ao nodded. Slowly, "Would you like to hear a story?" Suri exhaled, weary but curious. "I suppose I'm already here." Ao poured more tea. "There once was a young monk who tended to the temple's bell. It was his favorite duty. Every morning, before the sun rose, he would strike the bell 3 times slowly, reverently, so that the valley could awaken gently. But one day, another monk accused him falsely of negligence, claiming he had missed the morning ritual. The young monk felt rage climb into his chest. His hands shook. His breath became shallow. He stormed to the bell tower, gripped the mallet, and, in his fury, struck the bell with all his strength. It cracked. The sound was not pure. It was jagged, harsh, like a scream from metal lungs, shamed and regretful. The monk sat beneath the bell for 3 days without speaking. An old nun passed by and offered him rice. When he did not respond, she sat beside him and spoke softly. "You poured the tea of your heart too fast," she said. "Now the cup cannot hold it." "But I was right to be angry," he insisted. "Perhaps," she said, "but rightness poured like fire still burns the tongue, so I must never be angry." "No," she replied, "you must learn to listen to your anger without letting it pour first. Let it speak, not shout. Let it warm, not scald. Then it becomes a guide, not a weapon." Sari listened, hands curled around her knees. "I don't want to be quiet," she whispered. "Been quiet too long. But when I explode, I lose myself." Ao looked at her carefully. There is a quiet that is forced. That is silence born of suppression. But there is also a quiet that listens. That is presence, still. Strong a mountain is not weak because it does not yell. Sayuri nodded slowly. But the world doesn't hear stillness. It hears volume. Urgency, perhaps, Ao said. But tell me, when you scream, do they truly listen? Or do they just react back? She said nothing. Her fingers traced the rim of the teacup. The surface of the tea had cooled. It no longer steamed, but it was clear, calm. Whole, I've been told that if I don't speak immediately, I'll be walked over, Sayuri said. But reacting is not the same as presence, said Ao. And silence is not the absence of power. It is the space in which true power gathers. When you respond instead of react, your voice is not driven by the storm, it becomes the sky. Suri's shoulders softened. Her breath deepened. So I don't have to speak right away, she said. You can wait. You can breathe. You can feel fully. And only then you can choose. Outside, the wind passed through the bamboo stalks like the sigh of an old friend. A bell somewhere in the valley rang 3 times, pure, deep, without urgency. Sayuri stood, steadier now. Thank you, she said, for listening without rushing to fix me. Ao smiled. You were never broken, just boiled too fast. As she slid the door open, Ao poured the last of the tea into her cup. She paused, lifted it, and sipped. It was warm, not scalding, not cold. Just right, she bowed, and walked into the night. The lanterns lighting her path one at a time, gently, without demand, and behind her. The cup she had left behind tipped slightly of its own accord, and a single drop remained, whole, unspilled, quiet, present. Story 3. The bell that rang in silence, facing inner anxiety. It was the season when mornings lingered like questions, when dew clung to leaves a little longer, unsure of its place. The sun hesitated behind layers of pale clouds, and the village wore a kind of hush, not the silence of absence, but of waiting. In the hills above the village, hidden beneath cypress and pine, stood the old meditation, whole, simple in form, unadorned, yet saturated with stories. Inside the hall, the air smelled of incense and pine oil. Wooden floors creaked gently beneath every step, as if whispering old chants with each footfall. And at the heart of the space stood a great bronze bell, suspended by ropes woven from hemp and thyme. It had not been rung in 3 years. Master. Ao stood beside it, running a cloth gently along its edge, as if dusting off memory. He looked not at the bell, but at the doorway, where a figure stood hesitating. You may enter, he said, without looking up. The figure stepped inside, a young man in his 20s, wearing clothes too formal for the woods and eyes too restless for stillness. He bowed quickly, nervously, and introduced himself. My name is Haru. I came here because I can't breathe. Ao gestured for him to sit, which he did awkwardly, like a man trying to appear at ease while a storm raged within. My chest tightens at night, Haru said. I wake up unable to move. I can't focus. My thoughts rush like traffic with no lights. People tell me to relax, to think positive, to take deep breaths. But none of it works. The silence only makes it worse. Ao nodded slowly. The silence is not your enemy, but it reveals the enemy within. Haru looked confused, but curious. I don't understand. I want peace, but when I sit still, I panic. Ao walked over to a wooden drawer and pulled out a small bell handheld made of tarnished silver. He held it up and asked, "Would you like to hear a story?" Haru nodded. There once was a man who had a bell that rang every time he felt fear. He wore it on a string round his neck. At first, the bell rang only during thunderstorms or when wild dogs barked. But over time, it began to ring when people looked at him too long, when letters arrived at his door, when silence fell. Too deeply, he grew desperate. He tried to remove the bell, but every time he did, it rang louder. He stuffed it with cotton. It still rang. He buried it in the earth. It rang beneath his feet. Finally, in despair, he traveled to a hermit who lived at the edge of a frozen lake. The hermit listened and said nothing. Instead, he led the man to a cave deep in the forest. The only instruction he gave was this: "Stay here until the bell rings, no more." The man lasted 1 day before the bell rang, then 3 days, then 7. Each time, the bell echoed in his ears, a thunderclap of his own terror. But on the 8th day, he stopped trying to make it stop. He just listened. He let the fear come. He watched it. He named it. He breathed with it. And when he no longer tried to escape it, the bell grew softer, not silent, but kind. Ao placed the small bell in Haru's hand. "You are not broken," he said. "You are simply afraid of hearing your own sound." Haru's fingers trembled as he held the bell. "But what if the fear never stops?" "Then you will learn to sit beside it," Ao replied. "To drink tea with it. To walk in the forest with it. You may never silence it completely, but you can become its friend." Haru looked away, ashamed. "I thought I was weak. That maybe I'm just not built for this world." Ao stood and walked to the great bell. He placed his palm on its surface. "This bell," he said, "was once struck during every funeral, every war, every time the village suffered. It rang so often that people began to associate it with sorrow, so we stopped ringing it. We left it in silence." He turned to Haru. "But the bell itself did nothing wrong. It simply resonated with what we gave it." Haru frowned, trying to understand. "Your anxiety," Ao said, "is not your enemy. It is a bell. It rings because something inside you is asking to be heard. Not punished, not fixed, just acknowledged." Haru looked down. "I've tried everything: breathing, apps, medication, therapy. I don't know what else to do." "All of those things can help," Ao said. "But only if you stop treating your fear like an intruder. Let it become a teacher." He poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Haru. "When you feel the panic, rise. Don't fight it. Don't rush to distract it. Sit. Say to it, 'I see you. I know you are here. You are allowed to stay.'" Haru looked skeptical. "Won't that make it worse?" "At first," Ao said, "because you've spent years building walls against it. But one day, it will no longer need to bang on the doors of your chest. It will come in quietly, sit beside you, and you will both be still." The tea warmed Haru's hands. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently. The world had not changed, but something inside him had shifted. Just slightly. "I thought anxiety meant weakness," Haru said. "It means you feel deeply," Ao replied. "You sense danger in shadows others ignore. But you are not your fear. You are the one hearing it." Haru sat in silence for a while, no longer trying to rush the conversation, just being present. After some time, he asked, "May I strike the bell?" Ao nodded. Haru stood, walked to the great bell, and took the rope in his hands. He hesitated, then pulled gently. A low, deep sound filled the hall, clear, resonant. not mournful but alive. The sound faded into silence, and in that silence, Haru found something he had not expected. Not peace, not yet, but permission. Permission to be afraid, to not have answers, to ring and still be whole. He bowed to Ao, the bell, and to himself. And when he left the temple that evening, the clouds parted, briefly, letting in a sliver of late sunlight, just enough to guide his steps down the path slowly, gently, without panic. Story 4. The Monk and the Broken Bowl Accepting Impermanence. The rain came gently that morning, as though the sky were whispering. It wasn't the kind of storm that demanded attention, but rather a soft, steady tapping on the roof tiles, as if reminding the earth of its own breathing. Mist drifted between the trees, weaving in and out like wandering thoughts, and the world seemed quieter under the weight of water. In the back corner of the monastery garden, beneath a crooked maple tree, Master Ao sat alone. A wooden bowl rested beside him, split cleanly in two. Its fracture was not fresh darkened at the edges, smooth where time had worn down the wound. Still, it had not been mended. A small boy, no more than 10, approached with hesitant steps. His name was Kenta, the youngest novice in the monastery. He carried a broom far taller than himself and eyes too wide for someone who had already seen too much of life. Master, Kenta said softly, pointing to the broken bowl, "Why haven't you thrown it away?" Ao looked up, the corner of his lips lifting with a smile that held no urgency. "Would you like to hear a story?" he asked. Kenta nodded, settling beside him, the broom resting across his knees like a sleeping pet. Ao touched the bowl gently. There once was a monk named Ryoten who lived alone in a mountain temple far from the village. He was a quiet man, devoted to simplicity. Every morning he would eat his rice from the same wooden bowl which had been carved for him by his father before he joined the monastery. That bowl was more than a utensil, it was memory. It held the warmth of his childhood, the shape of his father's hands, the quiet rituals of his adult life. For 40 years he used it, washed it, honored it. One winter morning, while carrying it outside to wash in the spring, his foot slipped on a patch of ice. The bowl fell. It struck a rock. It cracked. Ryoten stood for a long time, snow melting into the folds of his robe, staring at the 2 pieces in his hands. And then, with great care, he wrapped the broken bowl in cloth and placed it on the altar. He did not cry. He did not curse. He simply bowed. The other monks were puzzled. "Why do you honor something that no longer serves you?" they asked. Ryoten answered, "Because it served me faithfully for 40 winters, because it taught me that even the most precious things break, and because it reminds me that nothing I love will stay the same, and yet everything I love is still worthy of love." Kenta looked at the bowl, his brow furrowed. "But if it's broken, it can't be used. Isn't that the end of it?" Ao nodded slowly. "It is the end of how it was, but not the end of what it meant. There is a difference." He picked up the bowl and turned it in his hands. We often think things must last forever to be meaningful, but permanence is not what gives something value. Presence does. The rain deepened slightly, falling like threads onto the maple leaves. Kenta whispered, "My mother had a cup she loved. One day I broke it, and she cried. I thought she was crying because it was expensive." Ao looked at him. "Was she?" Kenta shook his head. "She said it reminded her of the day I was born, that she drank tea from it when she waited in the hospital. I didn't understand. I was just a kid. But when I broke it, I felt like I'd destroyed something sacred." Ao nodded. "Not because it was perfect, but because it carried memory. Kenta's voice trembled. Sometimes I'm afraid I'll forget her face. You won't, Ao said. But it may not always be clear. It may visit you in strange ways, in the smell of warm tea, in the sound of rain, in the way your heart aches when you look at an old bowl. They sat for a while, both of them watching the bowl as if it might speak. After a time, Kenta asked, "Did Ryoten ever fix the bowl?" Ao smiled. He did, but not to use it again. He used a golden lacquer, the way some Japanese artists do kintsugi. He made the crack part of its story. He made the wound beautiful. Kenta's eyes widened. But why gold? Wouldn't that make it even more fragile? Perhaps, Ao said. But it also made it honest. The wind stirred. A few maple leaves drifted down and settled near their feet. In this world, Ao continued, everything will break. Every body, every heart, every bowl. To live is to accept this not with despair, but with reverence. If we keep trying to preserve everything, to keep it from changing, we miss the sacred rhythm of time. Kenta was quiet, his eyes lost in the dance of raindrops on stone. I wish people didn't have to leave, he murmured. So do I, Ao answered softly. But perhaps the leaving teaches us how deeply we can love, and how gently we must hold what is here. Kenta looked up. Do you ever miss anyone? Ao didn't answer immediately. Yes, he said. I miss my teacher. He died many springs ago. But I see him in the way I bow, in the way I hold a teacup, in the sound of the birds when I wake. He set the bowl down between them. Everything that ends ... continues in some quieter form. Kenta reached out and touched the bowl. His small fingers traced the crack, as if trying to learn its shape by memory. Do you think I'll break someday? He asked. Ao looked at him with a gentleness that made even the rain pause. We all do, he said. But the breaking is not the end. It is the beginning of a deeper kind of wholeness. They sat in silence, just two beings under a tree, listening to the world let go, drop by drop, and when the rain finally eased, the bowl remained unchanged in its fracture, but shining with the soft sheen of having been seen. Story 5. The cat in the temple garden, seeing beauty in the ordinary. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves like golden breath, casting dappled patterns on the stone path that wound through the temple garden. It was the kind of light that made everything softer, the chipped edges of old stone lanterns, the worn wood of the prayer posts. Even the spiderwebs glistening quietly in corners no one bothered to sweep. The garden itself was not grand. It had no rare orchids, no dramatic waterfalls or perfectly sculpted pines. It was simple, a few stepping stones, patches of moss, bamboo groves that leaned in the wind. But there was peace in its unevenness, a certain humility in its wildness. Master. Ao knelt beside a cluster of small weeds near the koi pond. His sleeves rolled back, his fingers gently pulling roots from soil. He moved without hurry, as though the weeds had grown just to give him something to do with tenderness. Nearby, a young woman stood watching him. Her name was Aiko, a painter who had traveled from the city to seek retreat after a long season of creative silence. Her canvases, once bursting with color and movement, had become blank. Her fingers, once eager to dance across paper, now hesitated as though afraid of their own longing. She had come to the temple hoping for revelation, or at least a stirring. Instead, she found quiet mornings, warm bowls of rice, the rhythm of bells, and this, a monk pulling weeds. This place is so ordinary, she said, not meaning to sound disappointed, but unable to hide it. Ao didn't look up. Ordinary is the fabric of everything sacred. ACO stepped closer. But how do you make something out of it? How do you create from what's plain? Nothing here feels like it's begging to be painted. At that, Ao stood and brushed his hands. Would you like to hear a story? Aiko sighed, but nodded. There was once a Zen nun named Hanako who lived in a mountain hermitage. She was a poet of some renown, though she never cared much for praise. Her verses were simple, often just 3 or 4 lines. People traveled far to hear her recite, hoping to discover the secret behind her clarity. One day, a young poet arrived, full of questions. He had studied with many teachers, read every classic text, practiced calligraphy with intensity, but his poems felt hollow, polished but lifeless. He asked Hanako, "How do you write poems that move people? What do you see that I don't?" She said nothing. Instead, she handed him a broom. He spent the day sweeping the mossy stones, refilling the water basin, boiling rice. No great truths were offered. No poetic insights whispered in the wind. Just tasks. After 3 days, frustrated, he asked again, "Where is the beauty here?" "I see only silence." Hanako pointed to the floor. A leaf had fallen into the water basin. Half submerged, it spun slowly in circles. "There," she said. "What? That is the poem. You missed it because you were waiting for a more dramatic moment." The poet watched. The leaf spun. Nothing else happened. But something in his chest stirred. Ao looked up at Aiko. "You are looking for a grand muse. But sometimes beauty hides in the unnoticed." Aiko frowned. "But I want to paint something that matters, something that moves people." Ao smiled. "What if what moves them is what they forgot to see?" Just then, a soft rustle came from the bushes near the garden gate. A grey cat emerged, thin, with a torn ear and fur like worn cloth. It walked slowly, with the air of a creature who had travelled far and trusted little. The cat stopped near the old stone lantern, circled it once, and then curled into a ball, tucking its face beneath its tail. Aiko watched in silence. The cat did nothing remarkable. It simply existed. Yet there was something in its stillness, its fragile dignity, that caught her attention. "Does it belong to the temple?" she asked. Ao shook his head. "No one owns it. It comes and goes. No one feeds it, but it survives. I've watched it sleep in that same spot for many seasons, always in the sun, always alone." Aiko stared at the cat. "It's not beautiful, perhaps." "Not in the way you were taught to recognize," Ao said. "But beauty is not perfection, it is presence." She sat down on the grass, sketchpad resting on her knees. Her pencil moved slowly at first, then with greater certainty. The lines she drew were not precise. The cat would not win any contests. But there was something honest about its pose, the way it yielded to the sun, the way it asked for nothing. "I've been trying to create something extraordinary," she said, eyes still on the paper. Ao nodded. "Extraordinary often hides in plain sight, the bowl we eat from, the wrinkles in an old robe, the sound of water dripping from a leaf. Zen does not seek fireworks, it seeks presence." Aiko looked up. "But how do you know when something is enough, when a moment deserves to be painted?" Ao walked over to the stone basin where another leaf had fallen. "When you stop waiting for it to prove itself," he said, "that's when it becomes enough." The cat stretched, yawned without drama, and wandered off without a sound. That evening, in her small guest room, Aiko lit a candle and unrolled her sketches. Dozens of incomplete drawings, discarded compositions, attempts at brilliance. And there, among them, the simple lines of a cat resting in the sun. She stared at it for a long time. There was no message, no metaphor, just a living thing witnessed. She picked up her brush. Outside, the garden slept under the stars. The temple bell rang once low, deep and perfectly ordinary. And somewhere beneath the maple tree, where the light was softest, a new painting began to breathe. Story 6. The boy who refused to cry, healing repressed emotion. The wind carried a sharpness that day, the kind that slides beneath the skin and settles in the chest, like a forgotten name. Clouds moved quickly above the monastery roofs, chasing one another like children who had once been storms. In the main hall, incense drifted upward in slow spirals, dancing toward the rafters where cobwebs trembled in silence. It was during the afternoon meditation that the coughing began. Not loud, but persistent. Not from illness, but from something. Else something clenched and hidden. Master Ao opened one eye and glanced sideways. A new face sat in the back row, legs trembling beneath a too stiff posture, shoulders tight like a bowstring stretched too far. A boy, perhaps 16, thin, pale. His fists remained closed the entire hour. After the session, while others filtered out in quiet footsteps and slight bows, the boy remained seated, unmoving, as though rooted not by calm, but by defiance. Ao walked over and sat beside him without speaking. The boy finally said, "I didn't come here for peace. I came here because my father sent me." His voice carried no weight, but his jaw clenched after every word. "My name is Daiki. I got into a fight at school. Again, they said I have anger problems. They said meditation might help." Ao nodded. "Does it?" Daiki shrugged. "I didn't feel anything, just heat in my head, like I was about to explode." Ao looked toward the altar. "Would you like to hear a story?" Daiki scoffed, but didn't say no. There was once a boy who lived in a village where no one cried. Tears, they said, were a weakness, a kind of sickness passed from one person to another. So the boy learned early to swallow his pain. When his dog died, he smiled. When his mother grew ill, he laughed. When his teacher struck him, he clenched his jaw and walked home without a word. But something strange began to happen. The boy's chest began to tighten. His sleep grew shallow. He snapped at people he loved. Eventually, he could no longer laugh, not because he didn't want to, but because the muscles in his face had forgotten how. One night, he climbed the hill behind the village and shouted into the sky, demanding an answer. An old man appeared from the trees. He was bent with age, but held a gaze so steady it made the stars still. The boy asked, "Why do I feel like I'm burning from the inside?" The old man said, "Because you buried a flood inside a furnace. I don't understand. You locked your tears inside. But emotions, like rivers, do not stop existing because we build walls. They only rise higher." The boy stood there in the moonlight, trying to find words. The old man continued, "There is no shame in sorrow. It is the rain that softens the soil. Without it, nothing grows." Ao fell silent, letting the story settle like dust. Daiki said nothing, but his jaw twitched. "I don't cry," he said. "Not even when my brother died. Everyone else broke down. I stood there like a statue. They said I was strong, but I couldn't sleep for months." Ao nodded, "And now, Daiki looked down. Now I get angry. For no reason, at everyone. I punch walls. I punch lockers. I imagine punching people who say the wrong thing. I'm not even mad at them. There's something stuck inside me, and it's like it wants out. Ao studied him gently. You're not angry at others, he said. You're angry at yourself for not breaking when your heart did. Daiki blinked. What? You mistook silence for strength, Ao said. But the strongest trees are the ones that sway in the wind, not the ones that never move. Daiki looked away. My father said crying is a waste, that it makes people soft. Perhaps your father was never taught how to grieve, Ao replied, so he taught you how to hide instead. For a moment, the wind outside paused. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. I don't want to cry, Daiki whispered. It's like there's a wall. Like I'm scared I won't stop once it starts. Ao placed a hand gently on the floor between them. Tears are not floods, he said. They are wells, and a well gives water slowly, enough to drink, enough to cleanse, not enough to drown. They sat in silence for a long time. At some point, the bell rang for the evening meal, but Daiki didn't move. His eyes stared ahead, distant, as if trying to see something invisible. And then, just barely, his bottom lip trembled. His shoulders rose, then fell. A sound escaped him, small, wounded, raw. Not a sob, not yet. But the beginning of something. Ancient rising to the surface. Ao said nothing. He simply remained, the way a tree remains. When a storm passes, the way the earth waits for the rain, and Daiki, the boy who had refused to cry for years, let one tear fall. Only one, it carved a path down his cheek like a river breaking free after seasons of drought. He wiped it quickly, ashamed. But Ao stopped his hand. Let it be, he said. It has waited long enough. That night, Daiki didn't eat. He sat beneath the camphor tree outside the meditation hall, arms around his knees, head tilted to the sky. And though no one spoke of it, a few monks passing by that evening noticed. The moonlight glinting off his cheek. Not water, not weakness, just the quiet return of something lost. Story 7. The cloud that didn't pass, sitting with Didnt, had been raining for days. Not the kind of rain that arrives loudly and leaves in a hurry, but the kind that settles deep into the ground and makes everything feel heavier. The clouds hung low over the hills like grey wool soaked through. The world looked drained of colour. Even the temple pond, usually lively with koi, lay still, as if its water had forgotten how to move. Inside the small study hall, candles flickered. Uncertainly, the tatami mats creaked as someone shifted weight from one side to the other, restless in stillness. A figure sat in the corner by the window, legs folded, arms wrapped around himself. His name was Koji, a man in his early 30s who had once been a musician but had not touched an instrument in nearly 2 years. He had come to the monastery not with questions, but with an emptiness he could no longer outrun. When Master Ao entered the room, Koji did not look up. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Ao said softly. Koji's voice was flat. Silence is never disturbed. It just becomes a little more aware of itself. Ao smiled faintly and took a seat nearby. You've been here a week, he said. You haven't spoken much. Haven't joined the morning chants. Haven't eaten with the others. Koji replied, I'm not here to be part of something. I'm here because I have nowhere left to go. Outside, the rain tapped at the window, steady and slow. Would you like to hear a story? Ao asked. Koji shrugged, but did not say no. There was once a man who lived beneath a mountain. Ao began. He was not poor, nor was he rich. He had a small house, a warm fire, and a garden that grew just enough. But one year, a strange fog descended from the peak and settled over his home. It did not lift, the sun disappeared. The vegetables stopped growing, the birds no longer sang. At first, the man tried to wait it out, certain the fog would pass. He brewed strong tea, read old poems, took long walks, but the fog remained. He began to wonder if it was a curse. He tried burning incense. He prayed. He screamed into the mist, demanding it release him. Still, it remained. Then one morning, too tired to resist any more, he sat on his porch and simply breathed. He watched the fog, not as enemy, but as companion. He studied its shape, its weight, the way it curled and moved. And in that attention, something shifted, not in the fog, but in him. He saw that it was not one thing, but many layers, currents, moments. It still surrounded him. But he was no longer drowning. Koji let out a long breath. Was he ever free of it? Ao tilted his head. Does freedom always mean escape? Koji looked away. Sometimes I wake up and feel like I'm underwater, and not the kind you can swim through. It's thick, grey, and even when I do everything, they say it well. Go outside, talk to someone that's still there, like a shadow that doesn't need light to exist. Ao nodded slowly. The world tells us we must always move forward, always feel better. But Zen teaches us something else, that there is wisdom in stillness, in staying. Koji said nothing. Ao continued. Depression is not always a hole to climb out of. Sometimes it is a room we must sit in until our eyes adjust to the dark. Only then can we see the shape of what lives there. Koji's voice trembled slightly. But what if I never feel joy again? Then you will learn the value of neutrality, Ao said. Peace does not always smile. Sometimes it simply means not fighting. Koji closed his eyes. It's not that I want to die. It's just that ... I can't remember how to want anything else. That is not death, Ao said. That is tiredness. And tiredness asks not for escape but for rest. The rain began to fall harder, a sudden curtain of sound. Koji opened his eyes and watched it streak down the window. There used to be a song I played when I was younger, he said. A quiet one, just a few notes repeating. People said it sounded sad. I didn't think so. I thought it sounded honest. Do you still remember it? Ao asked. Koji shook his head. My fingers remember, but my heart doesn't. Then perhaps, Ao said, you should let your fingers lead. Sometimes the body remembers how to return when the mind cannot. Koji leaned his forehead against the cold window pane. The rain on the other side matched the fog within. I'm afraid to try, he whispered. What if the music is gone? What if it's just waiting for you in the fog? Ao replied. For a long while neither spoke. Then, slowly, Koji stood. He didn't say thank you. He didn't bow. He simply walked out of the room, through the narrow corridor, toward the small practice room where instruments were kept. The door creaked open, and though he didn't believe anything would come, he picked up the shamisen that hung on the wall. His fingers moved, not easily, but not without memory. He didn't play the full song, just the opening notes, and though it didn't sound like joy, it also didn't sound like despair. It sounded like breath, like something old stirring in the mist. Outside the rain kept falling, and the cloud that had followed him for years remained. But for the first time, he sat with it, and the cloud, as if sensing his presence, softened its edges just a little. Enough to let the sound through. Story 8. The Thief Who Returned the Moon, releasing attachments. It was late evening when the lanterns were lit, one by one, down the temple path. The light from each flame pooled gently on the ground, like drops of quiet warmth in the cool night. Cicadas had gone silent, giving the forest over to the softer sounds of crickets and distant water. The moon had not yet risen, and everything felt paused, as though waiting for something not yet born. Master Ao stood at the threshold of the main hall, his silhouette outlined by the golden light behind him. From the shadows of the tree line, a figure emerged, slim, careful, clothes dark, hood drawn low. He walked as one trained not to be. Noticed, yet Ao watched him with calm, unhurried eyes. The man stopped a few steps short of the temple gate. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "Yet you are," Ao replied. The man hesitated. "I've come to return something." He reached into the folds of his coat and took out a small wooden box. Its corners were chipped, its lacquer dulled by age and fingerprints. Ao said. Nothing, only stepped aside to let him enter. Inside the temple, incense drifted lazily through the air. The man placed the box on a low table and took a seat opposite the master. His movements quick, alert, as if expecting to be judged or struck. "I took this from your temple 2 years ago," the man said. "During the Lantern Festival, I was hungry and angry and tired of being invisible." Ao opened the box. Inside was a simple silver locket in the shape of a crescent moon. Not valuable by market standards, but familiar in its presence. He lifted it and let it swing gently from his fingers. "I remember this," he said. "It belonged to a monk who left for the mountains. He said he no longer needed to carry symbols." The man lowered his gaze. "I kept it because it made me feel like I had power, like I had taken something. Sacred, like I mattered." Ao nodded. "Did it work?" The man laughed softly, bitterly. "For a day, maybe 2. Then I just felt ... haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the weight of what I'd taken. It's strange. I've stolen money, jewelry, things far more valuable than this. But this ... this followed me." Ao set the locket on the table. "Would you like to hear a story?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Is it about another thief?" "Perhaps," Ao said. "Or perhaps it's about someone who no longer needed to steal." He folded his hands. "There once was a man known throughout the countryside as a clever thief. He never used force. He took only what he needed. He was praised by some, feared by others, but always invisible to the law. One night, he broke into a monk's hut high in the mountains. He searched the room but found nothing of value, no gold, no food, no tools. Just a single candle burning. The monk, awake and watching, said nothing. The thief said, 'Have you nothing to offer?' The monk smiled. Only this moment the thief was irritated. 'You're mocking me.' The monk shook his head. 'No, I truly have nothing, but I can give you the moonlight if you stay.' The thief left, angry and empty-handed. But for nights afterward, he could not forget the monk's face, or his stillness, or the absurd offer of moonlight. Eventually, he returned. He brought back every item he had ever taken from others. He laid them at the monk's feet. 'I don't know why I'm doing this,' he said. 'It won't change anything.' The monk only smiled. 'It changes everything. Not because of what you returned, but because of what you released. The man across from Io was silent for a long time. He touched the locket gently. I thought having it would fill something, he said, but it only reminded me of how empty I was. Ao poured him tea, the warm liquid whispering into the cup. We all try to steal the moon, he said. We think if we can hold what is beautiful or pure or untouchable, we will feel whole, but the moon cannot be kept, only witnessed. The man looked down. I've lived my life taking from others their trust, their safety, their peace. I don't even know who I am without that. You are the one who brought the moon back, Ao said. That is a beginning. The man's voice dropped, but I don't feel forgiven. Forgiveness is not a feeling, Ao said. It is an action, and it begins with return. Not just of objects, but of yourself. Back to your own hands. Back to your own name. The man clenched his fists. I don't want to steal anymore, but I don't know how to live any other way. Ao nodded. Let go of the need to define yourself by what you take. Ask instead what you can carry, not for gain, but for care. The man stared at the locket. Is it really that simple? No, Ao said, but it is that clear. Outside, the clouds shifted. A break appeared in the sky. And there, quietly, the moon emerged, soft silver, untouched. The man looked up. It's beautiful, he said. Ao smiled, and no one owns it. They sat in silence for a while. When the man finally stood, he bowed not as apology, but as presence. He left the box behind, and as he walked into the night, the moonlight followed him not to mark him, but to remind him that sometimes the most sacred thing is not what we take, but what we're finally willing to let go. Story 9. The rice bowl of gratitude, gratitude through Supringer. Morning light crept slowly across the worn floorboards of the dining hall, casting long shadows of the wooden beams above. The monks moved in silence, their robes whispering against the floor, their hands steady as they set out simple trays, a bowl of rice, a cup of miso, a small dish of pickled radish. There was no conversation, only the soft clinking of ceramic and the low murmur of breath. In this monastery, meals were not eaten, they were received. Like small ceremonies at the far end of the hall, seated alone, was a woman in her 40s. Her name was Hannah. She was not a monk, nor a guest seeking spiritual thrills. She had come, a week ago, without explanation, carrying little more than a folded coat, a journal with blank pages, and a face carved by the quiet sorrow of someone who had learned to endure. She rarely spoke. She walked the gardens with a kind of ghostliness, as though searching for someone who had left their footprints in the earth. Master Ao noticed her each day, not by her presence, but by her effort not to be seen. That morning, after the bowls were cleared and the others had moved on to their chores, Hannah remained seated. Her fingers traced the rim of the rice bowl in front of her. Her gaze stayed low. Ao approached and sat beside her. He did not ask if she wanted company. He simply joined her in the silence. After some time, she said, "This bowl of rice tastes like my mother." It was not an answer to any question, but Ao listened as if it were. "She used to make it just like this," Hannah continued. "Steamed, no salt. She said it wasn't about flavor, it was about sustenance. I used to hate it. I wanted seasoning, sauce, anything that tasted like more than survival." She looked up, eyes still distant. "I didn't understand until much later, after she got sick. After she lost her job. After she started skipping her own meals to make sure we ate." And even then, I didn't say thank you. Ao looked at the empty bowl. Would you like to hear a story? He asked. Hannah nodded slowly. There was once a boy who lived in a small fishing village. Every morning, his mother would give him a bowl of plain rice to take to school. He envied the other children who had eggs, fish, sometimes even meat in their lunches. One day, in a moment of anger, he threw the rice away and told his mother he was ashamed of her food. His mother said nothing. She simply nodded and walked away. The next day, there was no rice, nor the day after. The boy grew hungry, then weak. Finally, he asked her why she had stopped cooking. She replied, "Because I thought you preferred to be hungry than to eat something that embarrassed you." He wept years later. Long after she had passed, he became a cook. But no matter what fine dishes he prepared, he always began his day with a single bowl of plain rice, without seasoning, without garnish. When asked why, he said, "Because it reminds me that love is not always extravagant. Sometimes it is quiet, and sometimes we only taste it fully after it's gone." Hannah's eyes had filled with tears. "I never thanked her," she said, "not even when I watched her hands shake from hunger. I just kept taking what she gave." Ao placed his hands gently on the table. "Gratitude is not always a spoken word," he said. "Sometimes it's a recognition that arrives too late and still transforms you." "But what do I do with it now?" Hannah whispered. "This guilt, this regret. Let it ripen," Ao said. "Not into punishment, but into reverence." She looked confused. "You cannot go back and thank her with words," he explained. "But you can live as if you were always thanking her. You can let every bite, every breath, every kindness you give to another carry the weight of that silent thank you." Hannah nodded slowly. "For a long time, I believed suffering was something to be hidden, something to survive and then forget. But lately, I think, maybe it's something to remember, not to cling to, but to learn from." Ao poured her a cup of warm tea. "Suffering is not noble by itself," he said, "but the meaning we make from it can be." Outside, the wind stirred the bamboo, their hollow stalks clicking softly like bones remembering how to dance. Hannah cupped the bowl in her hands again. She did not eat. She did not speak. She simply held it, as though for the first time she understood what it had always meant. Later, that afternoon, she went to the kitchen and asked the head monk if she could help wash the rice. Not cook, not serve, just wash. She stood at the stone basin for hours, fingers submerged in cold water, lifting and swirling the grains with care. She watched as the water turned cloudy, then clear, then cloudy again, as if grief could be rinsed from memory by repetition alone. And when she finished, she bowed to the bowl, not as ritual, but as gratitude. That night, as she lay in her room, listening to the wind through the wooden slats, she whispered a name she had not spoken aloud in years, and it did not break her. It blessed her, because now, finally, every grain of rice tasted like more than survival. It tasted like love. Story 10. The mirror without a face transcending the ego. The mountain air was cold and dry, the kind that cracks the skin without warning. Frost clung to the edge of the monastery's old roof tiles, and the stone steps that led down into the pine forest gleamed like glass in the morning light. It was winter, and the silence had deepened. Master Io walked slowly through the upper courtyard, his breath visible in the stillness, his hands tucked into wide sleeves. He passed the empty prayer flags that no longer fluttered, the leafless branches that stood like questions, and the wooden mirror hall. A small structure built long ago for the study of self-reflection. Inside that hall, in front of a mirror polished smooth by decades of cloth and contemplation, sat a man in black. He had arrived 3 days prior. His name was Shin, in his early 50s. With sharp eyes and posture honed from a career in command, Shin carried the quiet tension of someone used to being obeyed. He had spoken little, asked for nothing, and spent each day seated before the mirror in silence. Ao stepped inside the room and sat beside him without a word. The mirror reflected them, both Ao's lined face, calm and unfazed, and Shin's, rigid. Searching, I was told Zen might help, Shin said, not turning. But all I've seen are empty bowls, slow footsteps, and this mirror. What were you hoping to find? Ao asked. Something clear, Shin replied. An answer, or at least a version of myself I could recognize. Ao looked at the mirror. Would you like to hear a story? Shin almost laughed, a short breath through the nose. Do stories fix identity crises? No, Ao said, but they can loosen the soil. Shin said nothing, but did not refuse. There was once a man who collected masks. Ao began. Everywhere he traveled, he bought a new one. Some were carved with joy, others with sorrow, pride, wisdom, rage. He wore different masks for different people, one for his family, one for his work, one for his lovers. Over time, he forgot where his own skin ended and the masks began. One day, he was invited to a great banquet where truth was to be honored. Everyone was told to arrive unmasked. The man panicked. He had worn so many masks that when he removed the final one, there was nothing underneath. No face, no features, just a hollow. He fled, weeping. He begged a sculptor to carve him a new face, something real. But the sculptor said, a face is not something you make, it is something you uncover. So the man sat in silence for many years, letting go of every false expression. Slowly, painfully, beneath the layers, something true began to return. Not a face he remembered, but one that remembered him. Ao looked at Shin. You have worn many faces, he said. Shin's mouth tightened. I had to. In my line of work, being soft meant being dead. I was a soldier, then a leader, then a strategist. I became whatever the moment needed. I got respect, I got power. But when I left it all behind, I looked in the mirror, and he trailed off, and Ao prompted. Shin's voice dropped. I saw a stranger, someone always performing. The room fell silent again. Outside, a bird called once. Then was quiet. Ao reached into his sleeve and took out a small hand mirror. It was old, its back engraved with faded symbols, its surface slightly warped. This belonged to a monk who refused to look into it, Ao said. Why? Shin asked. Because he feared he would see not who he was, but who he had pretended to be. Shin took the mirror and studied his reflection. It's distorted, he murmured. Joe smiled. So is every image. Our minds do not see clearly. They filter through wounds, pride, longing. We mistake survival mechanisms for identity. Shin looked up. Then who am I, if not the sum of what I've done? Ao's tone softened. You are not your resume. You are not the medals, the mistakes, the moments you regret or celebrate. You are the awareness that observed all of it, that never left, that quiet watcher behind the face. Shin stared into the mirror again. I always thought ego was arrogance, he said. Ego, Ao replied, is the illusion that you are only what can be named. But how do you live in the world without it? Shin asked. Without boundaries, how do you lead? How do you love? You don't erase the ego, Ao said. You learn to hold it lightly, like a guest who visits often but never stays. They sat in stillness. The mirror reflected the frost outside, the sky beginning to pale with dawn. Shin finally whispered, I'm tired of playing roles, of being strong all the time. Then stop, Ao said. You don't need to be anyone here, just breathe. But what if I don't like what I find? You don't need to like it, Ao said. You only need to meet it. Kindness comes after honesty. Shin set the mirror down and bowed his head. Not a formal bow, not a ritual, just the slow surrender of someone beginning to loosen his grip on the mask. Outside, the first rays of sun spilled over the courtyard. The frost began to melt, bead by bead, vanishing without a sound. And inside the mirror hall, two figures remained, one with a face, one with a question, but both closer to something whole. Story 11. The sound of one darker pit had rained for 7 days without stopping. The sky was a thick curtain of slate, unbroken by sun or moon. The streams had turned into rivers, and the rivers into torrents. In the village below the mountain temple, water lapped at wooden thresholds, flowed through alleyways, and crept under doors. Farmers stayed inside, children pressed their faces to fogged windows, and the elderly lit incense, whispering old chants to calm the gods of water in the temple. Above, life moved slowly. Inside the hall of silence, a boy sat cross-legged on a woven mat, eyes closed. His name was Sora. He was 15, lean, sharp-boned, and full of questions that he often dared not speak. He had arrived at the temple 3 months earlier, sent by his father after a street fight, left another boy bloodied and Sora bruised, but unrepentant. The master, an aged monk known as Ryusa, had taken him in without judgment. Since then, Sora had swept the floors, chopped wood, hauled water, and sat in silence each morning and evening. But something within him was restless. He could not understand why the monks spoke so little, why they spent hours in the rain staring at moss, why the master answered riddles with riddles, or worse, with silence. On this particular morning, the rain tapped like fingers on the tiled roof, wind rattled the bamboo walls, the smell of wet pine filled the air. Sora shifted on his cushion, trying to quiet the storm within his chest. His mind was loud. What am I doing here? Why is no one teaching me anything real? What's the point of all this stillness? He opened one eye. The master sat before him, unmoving, eyes closed, breathing slow, Sora, scowled. Master, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Ryusei opened his eyes gently. Yes. I don't get it, Sora said. Why are we always just sitting? I want to learn something. I want to understand Zen. Ryusei smiled softly. And what is Zen to you? I don't know, Sora admitted. But it has to be more than silence. Silence, Ryusei said, is not the absence of teaching. Sometimes it is the teaching. Sora frowned. That sounds like something you'd carve on a rock. Perhaps, Ryusei said. But would you prefer a story? Sora perked up. Yes. Ryusei nodded once. Then listen well. He placed a single drop of water from his tea bowl onto the wooden floor between them. It hung there like a tiny jewel, trembling with life. There was once a young man, Ryusei began, who wanted to hear the sound of truth. He traveled across forests and deserts, asking every sage and mystic, what does truth sound like? Some told him it was the roar of the ocean. Others said it was the cry of a newborn. One man said it was the name of God whispered between breaths, but none satisfied him. Eventually, he found an old monk sweeping a temple courtyard. What does truth sound like? The young man asked. The monk said nothing, just swept. Angered, the young man shouted, "Why won't anyone answer me?" The monk held up a single finger and pointed to a puddle. Where rain had just begun to fall, a drop landed. Plink dot, then another, plink. The young man listened, plink, plink, plink. He waited for more, but the monk returned to sweeping. "That's it?" he asked. The monk nodded. "That's it." The young man didn't understand. Not then. He stormed off, frustrated. But years later, while sitting alone under a tree during a storm, he heard a drop fall from a leaf into a puddle. Plink. And suddenly he understood everything. Ryusei looked at Sora. "That is Zen." Sora blinked. "That's it." "A drop of water," Ryusei nodded. "That's it," Sora huffed. "But that's nothing. It's meaningless unless you already know something." Ryusei leaned forward. "What if I told you Zen is not something you understand? What if I said it is something you become aware of? Then how do I become aware? By listening." Ryusei said. "Truly listening." Sora looked again at the drop of water on the floor. It shimmered, caught in the soft light. He could see his reflection warped in its surface. It trembled, held together by tension, neither falling nor dissolving. "Don't hear anything," Sora murmured. Ryusei smiled. "Then sit longer." That afternoon, Ryusei gave Sora a task. He handed him a bamboo bowl. "Empty. Place this at the edge of the eaves," Ryusei said, "where the rain falls." Sora obeyed. He sat beside the bowl and watched. At first, it was tedious. The drops were irregular, inconsistent. Some missed the bowl entirely. Others landed with faint splashes. He leaned close, straining to hear the difference. As the minutes passed, his thoughts wandered. "I'm cold. I'm hungry. This is stupid." But the master had told him to sit. So he sat. Hours passed. The sound changed. Plit, plip, plip. Plip. He began to hear rhythm. Not a melody. Not music. Just presence. Just now, for the first time, Sora stopped thinking about how to learn. He just listened. He lost track of time when Ryusei returned. Sora was still sitting beside the bowl, eyes open but unblinking. "Did you hear it?" Ryusei asked. Sora nodded slowly. "Yes, and what did it say?" Sora struggled to find words. "It didn't say anything, but I wasn't trying anymore. I was just there." "That," Ryusei said, "is Zen." Sora didn't argue. He no longer needed to. From that day, he still asked questions, but not the kind that demanded answers. He still practiced silence, but not as a punishment. He still watched the rain, but now, not with boredom. He saw the sky empty itself drop by drop into the bowl of the world, and in each drop he heard not words, but truth, not because it explained anything, but because it needed no explanation. That night, long after the others had gone to sleep, Sora sat by himself beneath the eaves. The rain had softened, the clouds beginning to break. A single star peeked through the sky, as if blinking awake. He leaned close to the bowl of water and listened. Plink, and for a moment it sounded exactly like peace. Story 12. The wind that has nitrogen monoxide, DRSITONA, the foot of the eastern ridge, where fields of barley swayed like golden oceans and cranes moved slowly through shallow streams. There stood a modest tea-house with paper walls and no name. It was not on any map. Travelers did not find it by looking. They found it by getting lost. Inside that tea-house lived a man named Kenji, a former warrior whose sword had long been buried beneath plum trees behind the house. Few knew of his past. Fewer dared to ask. His hair had gone grey, and the fire in his eyes had settled into something like smoke, always moving, always searching, yet no longer destructive. Kenji served tea in silence. He bowed to every guest, poured with great care, and never asked why. They had come. Some stayed an hour, some stayed a day. A few never left. But all of them left something behind, a burden, a question, a grief. One morning, as the first wind of autumn swept through the valley, a young woman arrived at the tea-house. She was thin, pale, and wore the look of someone who had not slept well for many nights. Her sandals were torn, and her sleeves still bore stains from a journey through mud and thorns. Kenji said nothing. He simply nodded and gestured for her to sit. He brought out a pot of chrysanthemum tea, steam curling like incense between them. After the first sip, the woman finally spoke. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "what it means to make the right choice?" Kenji looked into her eyes and responded with a question of his own. "Is there such a thing as a right choice?" She flinched, as if struck by something invisible. "I thought there was. I thought if I followed my heart, it would lead me to peace, and it has not." Kenji asked. "No," she said bitterly. "It led me here, to nowhere." Kenji refilled her cup. "Nowhere is where most people begin." The woman shook her head. "I was supposed to marry the son of a merchant. My family depended on the union. It was all arranged house, future, children. But I didn't love him. I loved someone else, a monk. Foolish, I know." She laughed bitterly. "He told me not to leave my family, said his path had no room for a wife, but I did it anyway. I left. I waited, and he never came. I lost everything for a love that never belonged to me." Kenji listened without reaction. "I walk, and I walk," she continued. "Every day I wonder what if I had chosen differently. What if I had been wiser, or more patient, or less selfish?" "Do you want to go back?" Kenji asked. "I can't. It's too late. My family closed their doors. My lover returned to the monastery and won't see me. I have nothing now." Kenji lifted the teapot and poured a third time. "Sometimes the wind moves without direction, but it always arrives somewhere." She frowned. "What does that mean? Would you like to hear a story?" Kenji asked. The woman looked down at her tea. "Yes, I have nothing else to do." And so Kenji began. There was once a fisherman who lived beside a quiet lake. Each day he would cast his net and bring home enough fish to feed his family. He was not rich, but he was content. One day a great wind blew through the valley, and the lake grew wild. The fish vanished. The fisherman tried every cove and corner, but caught nothing, so he made a decision. He left his village and traveled far inland, seeking another body of water. He came upon a river, clear and swift, but the fish there did not bite, so he kept walking. He crossed mountains, deserts, and forests. He followed birds in the sky and listened to the cries of owls at night. He grew thin and weathered. Many told him to turn back. He refused. Finally, after many seasons, he came upon a hidden spring in the hollow of a forgotten mountain. The water was deep, and fish danced like silver leaves below the surface. He threw in his net. It came up full. He wept. Kenji paused. Letting the silence speak, the woman stirred. So, he found what he was looking for. Kenji nodded. Eventually, but only because he lost everything first. She stared into her tea. I don't know if I have the strength to keep walking. Then, sit, Kenji said. Let the wind carry you. But what if I never find anything again? Kenji met her gaze. You already have. You found this place. She laughed, a little too harshly. This place, it's nothing. Kenji smiled, and yet, here you are, breathing, drinking tea. Speaking, that is not nothing. The woman wiped a tear from her cheek. Why does it hurt so much to choose? Because choice is the death of all other possibilities, Kenji replied. But it is also the birth of your path. She sighed. Outside the wind picked up, rustling the bamboo fence, carrying yellow leaves across the path. Kenji refilled the pot with hot water, and said no more. The woman stayed that night. In the morning, she swept the floor of the tea house. In the afternoon, she helped carry water from the stream. In the evening, she lit the lanterns. She did not ask if she could stay. Kenji did not ask when she would leave. Days passed, then weeks. One day, a traveler arrived, lost, tired, uncertain. The woman welcomed him with tea. He asked her, "Do you ever wonder what it means to make the right choice?" She smiled and said, "Would you like to hear a story?" And the wind outside blew gently through the barley. Fields, moving in no particular direction, yet always arriving, always beginning again. Story 13. The bell that never rang in a small village nestled between two silent ridges, where mist lingered like memory and the air carried the scent of cedar wood and wet stone. There stood a temple. It was neither large nor renowned. No monks lived within its walls. Its gates were open, yet few entered. The path to it was not forbidden, merely forgotten. Inside the temple hung an enormous bell, carved of bronze, so old that moss clung to its base and spiders had woven tapestries in. Its crown, it had never rung. Generations had passed, and yet not once had the villagers heard its voice. No ceremonies, no festivals, no moments of crisis had coaxed even a whisper from it. Children dared one another to touch its surface. The brave ones placed their ears to it and said they could feel it breathing, though no one truly believed them. Over time, the bell became a fixture of local legends, silent, beautiful, and inert, a monument to something unspoken. But the villagers kept it there. They cleaned the steps. They swept the leaves. They placed incense by the altar, though no monks came to light it. They said nothing about why. Some things, they believed, were not meant to be explained. One spring, a traveler arrived. He was old, with eyes that seemed to reflect the color of whatever sky he looked upon. His clothes were simple, dusty from the road, and his sandals worn thin. He carried no staff, no bowl, no scrolls, only silence, as though he had long since forgotten the need for speech. The villagers watched him climb the temple steps. He did not knock. He did not bow. He simply sat before the bell, cross-legged and still, for 3 days and 3 nights. Children came and went. Women brought him rice and pickled radish. Men watched from a distance, whispering among themselves. But The traveller never moved. He sat as if waiting for a sound only he could hear. On the fourth day, the village elder approached. "Stranger," the elder said softly, "are you waiting for the bell to ring?" The traveller nodded. "It never has," the elder said. "Not once. Not even during the fire 30 winters ago when half our homes burned. Not when famine came. Not when the mountain cracked and the dead were carried down. It is just a bell that never found its reason." The traveller looked up and smiled faintly. "Perhaps," he said, "its reason has always been waiting for silence." The elder frowned. "Silence. All your stories of the bell come with noise, disaster, celebration, desperation, but a bell like this was not made to compete with the world's clamour. It was made to call what is already listening." The elder said nothing, but his hands trembled. The traveller stood, walked to the bell, and gently placed his hand on its surface. Then he turned and walked away. The villagers never saw him again. But that night, when the stars hung low and the moonlight pooled on the temple floor, the bell rang, not a loud sound, not a shout, just a single, deep, tremulous note that moved through the earth like breath, through the water like light, through the body like memory. Every villager heard it, even the deaf, even the unborn, they said. For a moment, the entire valley stood still. The wind did not stir. Dogs did not bark. Even the river paused its endless song. And then the silence returned fuller. Deeper. After that, things began to change. A child who had refused to speak since birth began humming softly in the fields. A widow who had worn black for 30 years planted a garden of red chrysanthemums. A drunkard who slept in the gutters rose early to sweep the roads. They never spoke of the bell again. It never rang again, but its silence remained years later. A boy who had been too young to remember the ringing asked the elder, now old and slow, why the bell had only sounded once. The elder closed his eyes. "Because it didn't need to ring again," he said. "Some sounds you don't need to hear twice." The boy asked, "But what did it mean?" The elder thought for a long time before answering. "It meant that we were already listening, even if we didn't know it. That everything we needed to hear was already inside us. The bell just reminded us to stop shouting long enough to notice." The boy looked up at the temple, where moss still curled around the bronze rim and vines crept up the stone pillars. "Do you think it will ever ring again?" The elder smiled. "If we forget how to listen," he said, "then perhaps it will." And the wind passed gently through the valley, silent, unseen, but somehow felt by all. Story 14. The old man who buried Tiamin, a forgotten village, surrounded by rice paddies and the echo of distant gongs. There lived an old man who wore no watch, kept no calendar, and yet was known as the timekeeper. He had no family, no wife, no children. His hut sat alone at the edge of the forest, where the cicadas sang at dusk and the fireflies blinked in slow rhythm. He rose before dawn, drank tea brewed over a fire he lit with a single match, and walked to the edge of the field where the earth was softest and the sky still half asleep, every day. At exactly the same hour, though no one could say which, he would dig a small hole in the ground, no bigger than a teacup, place something invisible inside it, cover it gently, and then bow 3 times. Then he would walk back to his hut, close the door, and not emerge until morning. Children were frightened of him. Adults pitied him. Some said he was mad. Others said he was a monk who had seen too much of the world and buried himself in ritual to escape its weight. But no one disturbed him. They let him bury whatever it was he buried. One day, a boy named Jun decided to follow him. Jun had a curiosity that buzzed like a bee trapped in a jar. His mother warned him to leave the old man alone. Let the mad bury their madness, she whispered. But Jun was not afraid of madness. He was afraid of not knowing at the break of dawn. Jun hid behind the old stone well and watched as the old man emerged from his hut. His steps were deliberate, not weary but measured. He held no tools, no bundles, just his hands folded behind, his back and his gaze toward the trees. Jun followed silently, stepping only where the old man had stepped, mimicking the way he avoided the dry twigs and the slippery moss. When they reached the clearing at the edge of the forest, the old man stopped, bent down, and began digging with his hands. Jun held his breath when the hole was dug. The old man reached into his robe and held something in his palms. Jun squinted. There was nothing there, yet the old man looked at his hands as if they held a sleeping bird. He whispered something. Jun couldn't hear the words. Then the old man placed the invisible thing into the hole, patted the earth over it, and bowed 3 times. He turned around and looked directly at the spot where Jun hid. "Come out, little wind," he said softly. Jun froze. "I smelled your question long before your footsteps." Jun stepped forward. His heart beat like a drum, but the old man's voice was not scolding. It was like rain on a dry roof, unexpected, but somehow welcome. "Were you burying something?" Jun asked. The old man nodded. "What is it?" "Time," he said. Jun frowned. "You mean like moments or memories?" "Both," the old man replied, "and neither." Jun waited for more. The old man sat down on a smooth rock. He gestured for Jun to sit beside him. "When I was young," he began, "I feared time more than death. I chased it with ambition, with hunger, with my hands full of clocks. I feared wasting a second. I scheduled my breath. I measured my heartbeats. I lived like a soldier guarding a vanishing army." "What happened?" Jun asked. "I lost everything," the old man said, "because time cannot be owned. The more I tried to possess it, the more it slipped through me." Jun looked down. "But why bury it?" The old man smiled. "Because letting go is not the same as forgetting. Some moments need to be placed in the ground, gently and with reverence, like seeds. Not to be destroyed, but to be transformed." Jun was silent for a while. Then he asked, "Can you teach me?" The old man's eyes sparkled. "Only if you promise not to hurry." From that day on, Jun came every morning to the edge of the forest. He brought his own small cup, filled not with water or tea, but with memories. The sound of his father's voice before he left for the city. The shape of his sister's laughter before she grew serious. The taste of rice on New Year's morning. Each memory he held in his heart, then let go into the earth. And each day he bowed with the old man. Weeks passed. Then months. One day, the old man did not rise from his hut. Jun waited outside until the stars began to appear. He entered quietly. The old man was lying on his mat, eyes closed, hands folded. Peace radiated from him like warmth from a stone. "I'm ready," Jun whispered. The old man opened his eyes. "I know," he said. "Today you must bury something else." Jun nodded. "You know," the old man said, "your fear of endings." Jun didn't cry. He bowed, as he had every morning, and left. That day, he dug a hole twice the size of a teacup. He whispered nothing. He placed no object. He simply let the earth hold the silence. Years later, John grew into a man with quiet eyes and a slow, deliberate walk. He never wore a watch. He kept no calendar. But every morning, he went to the edge of the forest and dug a small hole. Children came to watch. Some laughed, others grew still. One brave girl approached and asked, "What are you burying?" John looked at her and smiled. "Time," he said. She tilted her head. "Why? So I can grow something else. What grows from time?" John looked at the sky, at the trees, at the dew clinging to the grass like tiny lanterns. "Stillness," he said. "Gratitude, maybe even peace." The girl thought about this. "Can I try?" John handed her a small wooden cup. She closed her eyes and whispered something no one else heard. Then she placed her invisible offering in the ground, covered it with care, and bowed. That night, the wind moved softly through the forest. No one noticed, but for a moment, all the clocks in the village stopped ticking just long enough for a single breath to reach eternity. Story 15. The monk who swept Esachado was in the heart of a mountain cloaked in mists. Where no road dared to reach, and no bell dared to ring, there stood a temple made not of gold or marble, but of old cedar and stillness. This was no temple of grandeur, and no statues towered inside its walls. Yet those who wandered too far from sorrow sometimes found themselves there without knowing how. The temple had only one resident. His name was never spoken. The villagers at the foot of the mountain called him the Shadow Monk, though none had seen his face. He swept. That was all they knew. At the hour before dawn and the hour before dusk, he swept the temple grounds, the forest trail, and the path no wider than a footstep that wound toward the summit. His broom made no sound. His robes did not rustle. It was said that when the wind paused to listen, it could hear the sweeping. Many years ago, the monk had arrived at the temple with nothing but a torn robe and a scar over his heart. He spoke no words, bowed to no master, claimed no lineage. The abbot, then a man who had memorized 3,000 sutras and forgotten the taste of rice, allowed him to stay because he asked for nothing. And when the abbot passed away in his meditation, the silent monk remained. Pilgrims stopped visiting. The temple grew quiet, but the sweeping continued. One day, a woman named Lian arrived. She was not a pilgrim. She did not seek enlightenment or salvation. She came barefoot, her hair undone, eyes red as winter plum leaves dot in her arms. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She climbed the mountain not to find the monk, but to disappear from herself. When she reached the temple, she collapsed. On the steps, the bundle cradled to her chest. She did not cry, not at first, but the silence around her was too wide, and her breath began to shake. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing a wooden box no larger than 2 palms. Inside it, ashes dot her child, stillborn. For days she sat on the steps, unmoving. The monk swept round her. He did not speak. He did not offer tea or shelter. He swept the steps beside her, each stroke slow and deliberate, as though brushing away the dust of time. On the 3rd night, she whispered, "Why do you sweep?" The monk did not look at her, but he paused. To keep the path clear, he said, "For whom?" For those carrying shadows. She did not understand, but the words lodged in her like seeds in dry soil. "I brought death up a mountain," she said the next day. "I thought the wind would take it from me." He said nothing. She asked again, "Is there a ritual for letting go?" The monk knelt beside her. He took a small brush from within his robe, made of mountain grass and old horsehair. He placed it in her hand. "Begin with where you sit," he said. She stared at the brush. "But there's nothing there." He nodded. "Sweep, anyway." And so she did. At first, her arms moved without meaning, just brushing cold stone. Then she noticed the dust, the pine needles, the threads of moss creeping like forgotten memories. She swept. He did not help her. Instead, he walked to the far edge of the temple and swept a circle in the earth, drawing patterns like wind over sand. Each day, she joined him. Some days, she sobbed. Other days, she was silent. She asked questions the way one throws stones into a well expecting no echo. "What is sorrow made of?" He answered once, "Mist. If you chase it, it thickens. If you sit, it clears." Why did the Buddha leave? His child? The monk paused, because he did not yet know that the whole world was his child. Is it wrong to want him back? No. But wrongness is a robe we wrap around grief to make it look dressed. She swept harder. At night, she slept beneath the stars. The wooden box lay beside her like a quiet witness. One morning, she woke to find it gone. Panic struck her like thunder. She ran through the temple grounds, calling out. The monk sat beneath a tree, drinking tea from a cracked bowl. She fell before him. "Where is it? What did you do?" He said nothing. Then he pointed to the garden behind the temple, a place she had never entered. She walked there. At the center of a circle of stones was a young tree, its roots freshly planted. Beside it, her box, opened empty, placed in the soil. She dropped to her knees. Why? Because ashes feed roots, the monk said. She wept then not from rage or despair, but because for the first time something had moved within her without breaking. Will he grow with it? Yes. Will I? He nodded. From that day she stayed, not as a guest, not as a seeker. She swept. Each morning she took the path to the summit and back. Each night she brushed the temple stairs. The broom became a part of her arm, the rhythm part of her breath. Years passed. One day a traveler climbed the mountain. His face was drawn with worry. His eyes darted like frightened birds. When he reached the temple, he asked, "Is the monk here?" Lian looked at him. "He is in the wind," she said. The traveler did not understand. He knelt. "I lost everything." She handed him a broom. "Begin where you stand." "But I have no faith." She smiled gently. "Dust doesn't ask if you believe in it. It gathers and waits." He took the broom, and so it began again that winter. Lian planted another tree. This time, it was not to bury, it was to remember. Some say the shadow monk never existed, that he was a legend invented to soothe grief. But those who climb the mountain still find the temple. And they say, if you listen closely, in the hush between wind and leaf, you will hear sweeping, not to remove, but to make space. For healing. Story 16. The sound of an empty BOWL, the edge of the old capital. Nestled between withered rice fields and forgotten shrines, stood a small monastery known to few and visited by fewer. Its walls were no taller than a man, its gate always ajar. The bell above the gate had long lost its voice, rusted and wrapped in ivy. Inside, the monastery breathed with stillness. The abbot, there was a man of few words and even fewer possessions. His name was Master Hune, but most villagers simply called him the Quiet One. His room contained only a mat, a candle, and a single wooden bowl with a crack down one side. No disciples lived with him. No pilgrims stayed long. Yet every morning, without fail, He would descend the hill with his bowl and climb down to the market town. He did not beg, he did not speak. He simply stood in the corner of the square, holding out the bowl. Sometimes vendors placed a little rice or a slice of fruit in it. Sometimes they ignored him altogether. But he stood there, steady as a stone lantern, never judging, never reacting. And then one day, a man named V arrived in the town. VA was a scholar from the south, recently disgraced. After challenging a corrupt magistrate and losing everything, his once proud robes now hung loose over his shoulders. His scrolls were sold for food. His words, once revered, now brought him nothing but suspicion. One morning, hungry and bitter, Vaz saw the old monk standing silently with his bowl, his stomach twisted with hunger, but even more with shame. A child walked by and dropped a tangerine into the monk's bowl. VA scoffed. "This is what you've reduced yourself to, living off scraps." The monk did not respond. VA approached. "You stand there like a statue and expect the world to feed you. What wisdom is that?" The monk bowed lightly. It angered VA. "I spent my youth studying the Analects, the Sutras, the great philosophies. I taught kings and challenged tyrants. And yet here I am starving, while you, doing nothing, receive fruit from children." Still, the monk said nothing. VA grabbed the bowl. "What is this then, your life's work?" The bowl was light, nearly emptying the tangerine inside, but in his hand it felt heavier than stone. "You think this bowl makes you wise?" He turned it upside down and let the tangerine fall to the dirt. The monk reached down and gently picked it up, brushed off the dust, and placed it back into the bowl. VA stood frozen. The monk then turned and began to walk back toward the mountain. Something in that moment cracked Vu's anger like lightning over dry bamboo. He followed, up the winding path, past trees bent with age. They walked in silence. The climb was not long, but it exhausted him. At the top, he saw the humble monastery, its tiled roof missing corners, its garden overgrown but strangely peaceful. The monk gestured for him to sit. VA sat. The monk lit a small fire, boiled water, and brewed tea in silence. Finally, VA spoke. "You're mocking me, aren't you?" The monk poured 2 cups. He passed one to VA. The tea was weak, almost like water, but warm. "I lost everything," VA said after a while. "I tried to live with honor. I spoke truth. And now I'm nothing. Why are you calm? What secret do you know that I don't?" The monk lifted his bowl, showed the crack. "This," he said. The first word he had spoken. VA frowned. "It's broken." The monk nodded. "So am I then, why not throw it away?" The monk ran his thumb along the crack. "Because it holds still." VA stared at him. "That makes no sense." The monk smiled, not in mockery, but in understanding. "Once," he said, "I too was a teacher. I had students, a temple. I believed I could shape the world. What happened? Flood, fire, and my own arrogance." He set the bowl down. "When I lost everything, I clung to the memory of being someone. But hunger does not remember titles. Rain does not respect robes. I sat for days, waiting for my name to return." VA whispered, "Did it?" The monk shook his head. Only the bowl remained. VA looked down. The monk continued, "This bowl feeds me, not because I beg, but because I stopped trying to deserve. It is empty, therefore it can receive." Silence fell again. VA reached for his cup. The tea was gone. "Why is emptiness so frightening?" he asked. The monk replied, "Because we think it means we are nothing. But emptiness is only the space where things can be planted. The cracked bowl does not leak, it breathes." Va stayed that night, and the next in the mornings, he followed the monk to the town. He could not bear to hold out a bowl himself, but he stood behind, watching, ashamed and fascinated. In the evenings, he read the faded sutras in the temple, not to study, but to soften his mind. One day, he asked, "Will I ever feel peace?" The monk pointed to the garden. "Weeds have grown for years. You cannot remove them in a day. But if you pull one, plant one, water one, something changes." Va worked in the garden. He built a path of stones. He mended the bell rope. He learned how to sit, without trembling. Months passed. One morning, the monk did not rise. His body remained seated, his hands folded in the lap, his face gentle as moonlight, lit incense. He sat beside the body for 3 days. When the village heard of the monk's passing, they sent rice and fruit. They came up the hill to pay respect, not because they were told to, but because they remembered his silence. Va took the cracked bowl. He placed it at the center of the altar. He did not cry. Instead, he picked up a broom, swept the temple floor, poured tea. And when the time came, he descended to the market, the bowl in his hands, no longer ashamed. He did not beg, he did not speak. He stood still, and children placed fruit in his bowl. Story 17. The bridge that leads unowhr. There was a village at the edge of a winding river, surrounded by misty bamboo forests and endless rice fields that shimmered like green mirrors under the sun. The villagers lived simple lives, weaving, praying. In the center of the village stood a wooden bridge, arched and elegant, crossing the wide river that split the land. But strangely, the bridge led to nowhere. On the other side, there was only dense wilderness, thickets too thick to pass, mountains too steep to climb. For generations, the villagers told stories about the bridge, that it once led to a city, swallowed by time, or that spirits crossed it during twilight. But no one truly knew. The bridge, though beautifully crafted, was rarely used. Children played on its steps. Old men sat near its posts to watch the sunrise, but no one crossed it. It became a symbol, a puzzle, and eventually a forgotten relic, until one day a traveler came to the village. He wore no shoes. His robes were frayed. His face carried the dust of 1,000 roads and the calm of 1,000 sunrises. He was neither young nor old. His name, he said, was MC. He bowed to the villagers and asked if he could stay for a few nights. The villagers, curious and kind, gave him a place in the unused shrine at the edge of the forest. He accepted it. With gratitude, the next morning, the traveler walked to the bridge. He stood at its base for a long time, his hands behind his back, eyes half closed. Then he began walking slowly, one foot after the other, until he reached the other side. He stood at the edge, where the path vanished into wild grass. He bowed once to the forest and returned. The villagers watched from afar. On the second day, he did it again, walked to the end of the bridge, bowed to the forest, and returned. By the third day, children began to follow him, curious. "Why do you go there?" one of them asked. "There's nothing on the other side." MC smiled. "Is that so? There's just trees and rocks," another said. "You can't go anywhere." MC sat at the foot of the bridge. "Then perhaps I go there to arrive nowhere." The children looked puzzled. An old farmer approached. "Traveler, forgive me, but your walk seems meaningless. That bridge leads to nothing." MC nodded. "Yes." "Then why go to see?" "See what?" "The place where the road ends." The farmer scratched his head. "But why?" MC smiled again. "Because that is where truth begins." Now the villagers were truly curious. The next day, a few adults joined the children in watching him walk. When he bowed to the wilderness and turned back, one woman asked, "Are you praying?" "In a way," he said. "I am listening." "To what?" He pointed to the trees, the wind, the silence. "To what is not said." Over the weeks, more villagers began to walk the bridge. Some out of curiosity, some out of boredom, and a few quietly out of longing. The wilderness beyond remained unchanged, but the act of walking, stopping, bowing, and returning began to change them. One day, a young man named Tan approached. "MC, I've lost something," he said. MC gestured for him to sit. "My brother died 2 winters ago. He fell from the mountain while gathering herbs. Since then, I've lost my joy. I keep asking why." MC listened. "I thought maybe crossing this bridge would help. But it hasn't." "Have you reached the end?" MC asked. "Yes, many times." "And what did you find?" "Nothing." MC nodded. "Then perhaps it is time to walk slower." Tan frowned. "Slower, not to reach the end, but to feel the path." Tan looked at the bridge. "It's just wood, is it?" MC said. "And your brother's absence is it just memory?" That night, Tan walked the bridge again, but he took his time. With each step, he remembered something. The way his brother laughed, the time they argued over fishing lines, how he cried at their mother's funeral. By the time he reached the other side, he was crying, not because he found something, but because he no longer needed to. Weeks passed. The village changed, not in its buildings or roads, but in its rhythm. People began to take silent walks to the bridge. Some brought incense, others questions. A woman grieving her lost child came every morning. A retired soldier with haunted dreams came at sunset. Even the local monk, once stiff and formal, began to smile more. The bridge had become something sacred, not because it led somewhere, but because it did in single quotes. One morning, the traveler was gone. No one saw him leave. He left no note. Only his sandals at the foot of the bridge, and beside them, a bowl of wildflowers. The villagers built a small bench at the end of the bridge, not for worship, but for sitting. Years later, a child born long after MC had gone asked her grandfather, "Why is there a bridge that leads nowhere?" The old man, once the boy who questioned MC, replied gently, "It doesn't lead nowhere, it leads within." And so the bridge remained silent, unchanged, open, a place where paths ended and peace began. Story 18. The bell that never rang in the remote hills of the eastern province. Nestled among groves of camphor trees and banks of mist-shrouded stone terraces, stood an ancient temple named Sichutan. It was modest in structure, with weathered roofs and wooden beams that creaked softly in the wind. What made this temple unique was not its age or location, but a single large bronze bell that hung in the center of its courtyard, a bell that had never once been rung. No one alive could remember hearing its voice. The villagers said it had been cast centuries ago by a wandering monk who poured not only metal into the mold, but also a vow of silence. The legend went that the bell would only ring when someone truly heard it, not with ears, but with the soul. Of course, many had tried. Travelers, monks, warriors, and scholars came to the temple over the decades to strike the bell. Some used mallets of sacred wood. Others chanted sutras or brought rare offerings. But when the mallet touched bronze, there was no sound, only the dull thud of metal refusing to wake. And so the bell remained a mystery, a challenge. A mirror then came Skung. She was a young woman from the village far below, quiet and unremarkable in the way most mountain girls are. Her parents had died in a fire when she was a child, raised by an uncle who drank more than he worked. Skung spent her days tending goats and her nights sitting by the river, humming songs no one else knew. People said she was gentle, perhaps too much so for a world that chewed softness like rice husk. But she never seemed bitter. One winter, when frost coated the trees like silver lace and breath turned to smoke, Skung climbed the long path to Chutun. She didn't come with prayers, nor did she carry gifts. She came with silence. The monks watched her quietly. She bowed at the gate, then walked straight to the bell. No tourists were present that day. The temple was empty but for wind, birds, and the soundless presence of history. She sat beneath the bell dot, not to ring it, but to be with it every day for 99 days. She came. Sometimes she brought rice balls wrapped in banana leaves. Other days, just herself. She sat in the same spot, her back straight, eyes closed or half-lidded, hands resting softly in her lap. The bell never moved. Neither did she. By the 60th day, the monks began to murmur. Some questioned her purpose. Others admired her discipline. One young monk, curious and bold, approached her one morning. "Why do you sit here?" he asked. She looked up to listen to the bell. "No," she said. "To myself." He frowned. "And what do you hear?" "Everything I used to cover with noise." The monk said nothing more. He sat beside her the next day. By the 73rd day, more villagers came to watch. A few even tried to sit with her, but most grew restless. After 10 minutes, they would shift, sigh, check the sun. She remained still. By the 88th day, an elder monk, once skeptical, now brought her tea in the morning. By the 95th, the abbot himself sat near the temple door, observing. On the 99th day, Skung arrived before dawn. The moon was still visible, a pale ghost against a fading night. She bowed 3 times, then sat this time. She did something different. She stood. She approached the bell, and gently, with an open palm, she touched it. Not struck, not pushed, just touched. The bronze was cold. Then before any wind stirred, before any bird called there, was a sound. It was not loud. It did not echo through the valleys. It did not shake the earth. But it was real, a soft, pure tone, like the first note of a lullaby sung by the universe itself. Those present froze. The abbot's breath caught. The monk who had once questioned her wept. The villagers gasped, some clasping their hands as if in prayer, though no words escaped them. Skung smiled. Not in triumph, but in recognition. As though the sound had always been there, waiting not to be made but met. That night, the temple was quieter than ever. Even the wind seemed to bow in stillness. The bell did not ring again, nor did anyone try. The next morning, Skung did not return. Some said she went back to her goats, to the river songs and the quiet fields. Others claimed she left the village entirely, heading west, where the clouds kissed the cliffs. A few whispered she never truly existed, that she had been a spirit, sent to wake what could not be woken. But the monks of Chutar knew better. They did not speak of miracles, only of stillness and listening. The bell remains to this day, unmoved. But on certain mornings, if one sits long enough, with enough silence in the chest and enough openness in the spine, one might feel a vibration, deep and soft, not in the ears, but in the marrow. A bell that never needed to ring, because it was always ringing. Story 19. The wind that a return need there was once a monk named Daisetsu, who lived in a remote Zen hermitage, high in the northern mountains. Unlike other monks who resided in communities or trained under masters, Daisetsu chose to live alone in a crumbling stone hut that had no walls, only open pillars and a slanted roof. Snow would drift in during winter. Wind howled through the slats in spring. Yet Daisetsu remained unmoved, sitting on a flat stone slab for hours each day, wrapped in nothing but an old robe and silence. Travelers who passed through the valley often heard rumors about him. They said he was once the most promising disciple of the Grand Temple in Kiso, known for his eloquent lectures and piercing questions. But one day, during a formal tea ceremony, he stood up halfway through pouring and walked out of the hall without a word. He vanished for years now. Those who dared visit found a man with a beard like dry moss, skin the color of wet bark, and eyes that seemed always halfway between memory and sky. He rarely spoke, never gave sermons, and offered no teachings, only tea made from pine needles and bitter mountain herbs. It was said that Daisetsu was waiting for something. One spring, a young samurai named Gen came to the hut. He was not seeking wisdom but escape. Months earlier, he had slain a bandit lord who had terrorized villages near the border. Though the act brought him honor, it also brought the ghost of blood. He found himself unable to sleep. The faces of the dead returned. In dreams, his sword felt heavier by the day. He had heard of the hermit monk and thought, perhaps silence could cleanse what steel could not. Daisetsu said nothing when Gen arrived. He merely pointed to the flat rock opposite his own. Gen sat for hours. Then, for days, then for weeks, they shared no words. The wind did all the talking, rattling the pine branches, whistling through the open beams, lifting the hems of their robes like invisible hands, testing warmth. Rain fell without apology, cold wrapped itself around their bones. At first, Gen grew frustrated. He wanted answers, visions, release, but all he received was tea and weather. Then, slowly, something began to shift. It was not revelation, it was erosion. The layers he wore, pride, grief, fear, began to wear away. There was nothing to do but sit, to breathe, to watch the clouds roll in, then vanish, to hear the birds call in the distance, then fall silent, to feel the numbness in his knees give way to something deeper. On the 27th day, he finally spoke. "I thought you would. Teach me." Daisetsu did not move. "I thought I could forget," Gen said. Stillness. "I thought I came here to escape death." A long pause. Then Daisetsu finally opened his mouth. "You came here because the wind did not return." Gen blinked. "What? Does that mean?" Daisetsu closed his eyes. "When we are born, we are like bamboo chimes, hollow, open. The wind comes. It sings through us. But over time, we fill with noise, ambition, memory, blood. The wind cannot enter. And when it cannot enter, it does not return." Gen frowned, sowed the silence. "Is to call it back?" "No," Daisetsu said. The silence is to empty yourself. The next morning, Jen awoke before dawn. Desetsu was already sitting, facing the east, where a thin line of orange split the horizon. The air was still, the kind of stillness that made one doubt whether time was even moving. Then a breeze, soft, then stronger, and as the first gust swept through the open hut, the wind carried with it a sound low, resonant, and clear. A hum, almost like a flute, almost like a voice. Passing through the beams and across their skin, it was as if something had returned. Jen closed his eyes. He did not cry, but he felt the tears nonetheless. That night, he sat until the stars came out, and the wind circled again. It entered his chest, filled his lungs, then moved on, leaving behind not absence, but space. He stayed 3 more days. When he left, Deisetsu said only one thing: let the wind keep passing through you. Don't trap it. Jen nodded. Years later, he became a gardener for a small temple in the south. He never returned to the sword. He spoke little, but children liked to sit with him. He would tell them to listen for the wind. Some laughed, some looked puzzled, but a few sat very still, and sometimes, when no one was watching, he would stand beneath the tall bamboo grove behind the temple, arms open, and wait. And in the breath of wind that came, he always heard the monk's voice, not in words, but in the music of emptiness made sacred. The wind had returned, because he had made room. Story 20. The sound of the bell that never rang. There was once a temple tucked away in the forested hills beyond the river province of Tanama. It was not large nor particularly famous, but its grounds were revered by those who knew of it. Travelers often said that stepping through its worn wooden gate felt like entering a memory from another life, a world untouched by haste or ambition. At the heart of this temple stood an old bell tower. The bell inside was cast of dark bronze, weathered by centuries of mist and wind, but it had one peculiarity: it had never been rung. The story passed down from elder to elder was that the bell was forged not for sound, but for silence. When the new abbot, Master Shnan, arrived at the temple, he was young, earnest, and curious. He had studied in many monasteries across the land, heard countless kounds, and endured long years of discipline. But this temple, with its quiet grounds, and the strange untouched bell, stirred a restlessness in him. On his 3rd day, he stood before the bell and asked the oldest monk, a man named Riku, who swept leaves every morning at sunrise, "Why is this bell never rung?" Riku didn't stop sweeping, because it already rings. Shnan waited for more, but Riku moved on, humming softly. Perplexed, Shnan asked the other monks. Some smiled and changed the subject. Others spoke of a legend that if the bell ever rang, all who heard it would awaken instantly, but to what none could say. Others claimed the bell was simply cracked and unfit to use. But when Shnan examined it, he found no flaw. Its surface bore no fracture, and its clapper remained intact. Each morning, he would walk up to the tower and gaze at the bell. Its silence grew louder with time, like a question he could not shake off. Weeks passed, seasons changed. One evening, just before winter touched the hills with frost, a traveler arrived. She was a woman in her 60s, dressed plainly in grey robes, carrying a single satchel and a walking stick. She asked for a place to rest and was offered a spare room behind the meditation hall. That night, the monks heard her crying, not loudly, but deeply, like rain falling through cracked roof tiles. When Shnan visited her the next day, she sat in stillness, eyes red but peaceful. "I lost my son," she said. In a fire, I came here not to escape pain, but to sit with it until I can bow before it. Shnun offered her tea. You are welcome to stay as long as you wish. She remained at the temple for 3 months. Every morning, she walked alone through the pines. Every evening, she sat beneath the bell tower. One day, she asked Shnun, "Why does the bell not ring?" He told her what he had heard, about the silence, the awakening. She nodded and said, "It reminds me of grief, always present, never." Voiced, he didn't know how to respond. One night, snow fell in soft layers across the temple roof. Shnun could not sleep. He wrapped himself in his thick robe and wandered to the bell tower. To his surprise, the woman was already there. Seated in the snow, eyes closed, he sat beside her. Neither spoke. The moon filtered through the trees, lighting the bell in silver. She finally whispered, "Do you want to hear it?" He turned to her. "Yes." She smiled sadly. "Then don't strike it." He was confused. "Why?" "Because you already do," she said. "Every time you listen for it." The next day she left before dawn. Her room was empty except for a note. "Thank you for holding silence with me." It rang. Shnun felt something shift, not in sound, but in space. The bell seemed heavier now, though it had not moved. He began to understand what Riku had meant. The bell did not need to be struck. Its silence was its offering. But still, a part of him longed to hear its voice. Years passed. Shnun aged. His beard grayed. Riku passed away quietly under the plum tree he tended each spring. A young novice named Kai joined the temple. Eager and thoughtful, Kai reminded Shnun of his younger self. One day, the boy asked him, "Why don't we ring the bell?" Shnun smiled, just as Riku had, and said, "Because it already rings." Kai furrowed his brow. "I don't understand." "You will," Shnun said, "but don't try to." That night, Shnun returned to the tower and stood before the bell. He closed his eyes. He listened not just with his ears, but with his whole being. He heard the rustling of wind through pine, the shift of snow on the eaves, the pulse in his fingertips, and beneath it all, the bell's presence strong, still, unspoken. He bowed to it. The next morning, he began writing a new koan for the novices. It read, "A student asked the master, 'What is the sound of the bell that never rings?' Master said, 'The one you carry but cannot name.' And so, the bell remained, untouched, yet ever resounding in the hearts of those who sat beneath it. For some bells are not meant to be heard, but remembered. Not meant to shake the air, but the soul. Story 21. The garden that never Bieloe Medin, a remote village cradled by rolling hills and veiled by mists year-round. There was a small temple, known not for its teachings, not for its scriptures, not even for its monks, but for its barren garden. Sat behind the main hall, surrounded by a low bamboo fence, and inside it, row after row of earth stretched, tilled but unyielding. No flowers, no shrubs, no vegetables, just soil. Each season, the villagers passed by it in curiosity. Some whispered it was cursed. Others said the monks had neglected it. But none dared enter. The abbot, Master Yorin, had lived there since his youth. He was a man of few words, even fewer explanations. He spent his mornings tending the soil of the garden with quiet diligence, and his afternoons sitting by the bell, reading letters that never came. When travelers asked him about the empty land, he would smile and say, "It blooms where it cannot be seen." In the same village lived a boy named Daiki. whose father had recently passed away. Grief clung to the household like mildew, silent, ever present, staining every corner. His mother cried often at night, and Deki would pretend not to hear. At school, Daiki fell silent. He stopped drawing. He avoided his friends. One day, after a particularly harsh winter rain, he wandered aimlessly and found himself at the edge of the temple's garden. Master Yorin was there, kneeling in the mud, digging slowly with his bare hands. Daiki watched him. The old monk looked up and nodded. "Would you like to help?" Daiki shrugged, but walked in. They dug side by side for an hour. Then Yorin said nothing, and Daiki found the silence comforting. When he returned home that evening, his hands were covered in soil, but his chest felt just a little less heavy. The next day, Daiki returned, and the next. Weeks passed, then months. Each morning, he and the abbot tilled, watered, planted seeds that looked like grains of dust, picked out pebbles as though they were diamonds. But nothing grew. Once, Daiki asked, "Why won't anything sprout?" Yorin looked at the sky and said, "Because we are not planting to harvest." That confused Daiki. He had helped his grandfather grow cucumbers in the past. Gardens meant food, or beauty, or at least something to show. But here, the soil remained unchanged. One spring morning, a group of pilgrims visited the temple. One of them, a scholar from the city, pointed at the garden and laughed. "What sort of monk spends years growing emptiness?" Yorin smiled. "The kind that knows not all roots grow upward." The others chuckled and left Daiki, burned with quiet shame. That afternoon, he turned to the abbot and asked, "Why do we still work? A garden that never blooms." Yorin's gaze softened. "Because something is blooming. You just cannot see it." That night, Daiki went home angry. He refused to return for 3 days. On the 4th, he sat by the window, watching the hills melt into dusk, and felt the ache return, a dull pressure in his ribs, a restlessness in his limbs. He missed the silence. He missed the garden, so he went back. Yorin said nothing, just handed him a shovel. They resumed then. One summer, a drought came. The grass outside the temple browned, trees curled inward, even the river shrank. Yet every day Yorin carried buckets of water from the well and poured them over the empty beds. Daiki followed, sweating, blistered, but never complaining. At the height of the heat, Daiki collapsed one afternoon beside the garden. Yorin brought him water, wiped his forehead, and whispered, "Let the earth rest when your body cannot." They sat together for hours in the shade, listening to the sound of insects. Later that year, Yorin's hands began to shake. His steps slowed. He no longer dug, but sat nearby, guiding Daiki with nods and glances. Daiki took over the labor without protest. The garden, still barren, became his anchor. On a winter morning, Yorin handed Daiki a box. Inside were dozens of tiny paper cranes. "I folded one each day we worked together," he said. "One for each seed we planted, whether in soil or in spirit." Daiki didn't understand. Then Yorin added, "Some gardens grow only in the heart." Weeks later, the abbot passed away in his sleep. At his funeral, monks from other temples came. They performed chants. Villagers brought incense. Daiki stood quietly by the garden, watching the wind trace invisible paths across the bare earth. In spring, a new monk arrived, cheerful, unfamiliar. He found Daiki still tending the garden, now alone. The new abbot approached and said, gently, "Would you like to plant flowers this year? Maybe some herbs?" Daiki shook his head. "It's already blooming." The monk looked around at the bare soil. I don't see anything, Daiki smiled. You will. Years passed. Daiki became the new caretaker. Children from the village would visit and ask him, why does nothing grow here? He would hand them a spade, gesture to the earth, and say, help me for a while, then you'll see. Some never returned, but a few did. They came back again, and again. They sat in silence. They dug with their hands. They wept without reason. They laughed unexpectedly, and they left lighter, for the garden, though barren to the eye, held the weight of 100 silent stories. It had become a sanctuary, not of petals or leaves, but of presence, of grief, of healing without spectacle. And though no flower ever bloomed, those who stepped into it often found something within themselves take root. The garden that never bloomed had become a place where souls were planted, and in that it was the most abundant garden of all. Story 22. The well at the edge of the Via Lage, the furthest edge of the valley, where the mountain's shadow met the rice fields, there stood an old well. No plaque marked its origin. No rope hung from its wooden frame. It was dry, the villagers said, forgotten. Yet every few days someone would pass by and glance down its dark throat, half expecting a voice to rise from below. The well had a story, of course. All old things do. Decades ago, an old monk named Renji had once lived in a small hut nearby. Renji was not a temple monk. He had no disciples, no shrine, no altar, only the well. And he guarded it like a treasure. Children dared each other to run up and touch the moss-covered stones, but none stayed long. They said Renji's eyes were too quiet, as if he saw through you, and when asked what he was guarding, he would smile and say, not water, not wishes, just silence. When Renji died, no one took over. The hut crumbled, the roof caved, and the well remained silent, still and avoided. Years passed. The village changed. Roads were paved. A school was built. The forests shrank. But the well stood untouched, until one day a young girl named Aiko wandered too far from home. She had been following a dragonfly, tracing its path through the trees behind her house, and before long she found herself at the edge of the village. The sun had begun to dip, painting the sky in hues of gold and ash, when she spotted the well, curious. Aiko stepped closer. There was something about its stillness that drew her in, not fearsome, but deep. Ancient dot, she peered down, only darkness. But then, faintly, she heard it, a breath, not hers, not wind. A long, slow exhale, like someone waking from a dream. She jerked back, heart pounding, but something rooted her there. A feeling not of danger, but invitation. That night, she dreamed of the well. In the dream, it wasn't empty. It was filled with stars. Constellations shimmered in the water's surface. She saw reflections of faces she did not know, some weeping, others laughing. She woke with the scent of earth in her nose. The next day she returned, and the next she brought small offerings, a leaf, a feather, a folded poem. She whispered secrets to it, questions she couldn't ask her parents, fears she couldn't name. The well never answered, but it never turned away. Over time, others noticed Ico's visits. Her grandmother asked, "Why do you keep going there?" Ico replied, "Because it listens." At first, the villagers laughed, but slowly something changed. One evening, a woman in her 50s approached the well, carrying a worn photograph. She stood for hours, weeping. Before laying it at the edge, and walking away lighter. Another time, a young man came just before dawn. He didn't speak, only sat with his hands in his lap, eyes closed. He returned every week thereafter, each time, standing a little straighter. The well became quiet company for the broken-hearted, the lonely, the wandering, and Aiko. She became its silent steward. She swept away the leaves. She painted its rim with water from spring rain. She sang to it sometimes. Not songs of joy or sorrow, but lullabies that had no words. One autumn, a great storm struck the valley. Trees fell, roofs lifted, and by morning the fields were flooded. The villagers gathered to assess the damage. When they reached the edge of the village, they gasped. The well had split. A large crack now ran down its side. Stones had fallen in. Some said it was no longer safe. Others proposed sealing it altogether. Aiko stood before it, trembling. That night she could not sleep. She felt as if part of her had broken too. She returned in the early hours, before the rooster called. She knelt beside the well, pressed her hands against the cracked stones, and wept. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I couldn't protect you." Suddenly, the ground beneath her rumbled, not violently, softly. She peered in, and for the first time, water shimmered below, clear still, deep. The village awoke to news that the well had filled. It was impossible, of course. The well had been dry for decades. No rain could fill it so quickly. No underground spring had ever been mapped. But the water remained. Some said it was a miracle. Others claimed it was coincidence. But Aiko knew better. She began drawing water from the well each day. She gave it to elders for their aching bones, to children with fevers, to grieving parents. None were healed overnight, but all spoke of dreams that soothed, of hearts that softened. The villagers began calling it the listening well. In time, they rebuilt the hut, not as a shrine, but as a refuge, a space for silence, a room for reflection. No offerings were required, only presence. One afternoon, a traveler came to the village. He was weary, with sunburned cheeks and torn shoes. He asked for a drink, and someone pointed him to the well. He approached Aiko, who stood nearby. "May I?" he asked. She nodded and handed him a cup as he drank. His eyes welled with tears. "It tastes like home," he whispered, and perhaps that was its secret. The well did not grant wishes. It did not heal bodies. It simply held space for sorrow, for memory, for truth unspoken. In its silence, it mirrored what lay buried within each heart. Years later, when Aiko was old and her hands were lined like tree bark, a child approached her and asked, "Why do you still care for the well?" She smiled, eyes distant, because it once listened to a girl who had no words. And with that, she poured a final cup of water, knelt at the rim, and whispered a story into the depths. Her story, the well's story, the story of a village that learned how to hear. The wind carried it away. The well remained, still, deep, listening. Story 23. The bird that sang to the Ston, a forgotten forest. Hidden behind veils of mist and tangled vines, stood a solitary stone. It was no ordinary rock, but one shaped like a lotus in bloom, as if carved by unseen hands long ago. Travelers who happened upon it often stopped in reverence, though they rarely knew why. It radiated a quiet gravity that pulled at something deep in the chest. Legends whispered that the stone was once a monk who had turned his body into stillness after a vow of eternal silence. Others claimed it was the heart of a mountain weeping, for the trees felled around it. But none truly knew and the forest, old and overgrown, kept its secrets close. One crisp spring morning, a small bird arrived. Its feathers were plain, brown like damp bark, with a single streak of white on its breast. It was not large, nor graceful, but it carried a song inside it that no one had ever heard. The bird had been flying for days without purpose. Its flock had scattered during a storm, and though it had tried to find them, the sky gave no answer. Tired and thin, the bird spotted the clearing and descended, perching atop the strange stone. The moment its claws touched the surface, the air around it shifted. The wind ceased. The branches held still. Even the insects paused. The bird tilted its head and chirped, a short, unsure note, then another. There was no echo, yet something within the stone hummed softly in return, a vibration like breath beneath. The surface intrigued. The bird began to sing. It was not the song of territory or mating, not the usual melodies known to its kind. It was a song of searching, of solitude, of longing, and the forest listened. From that day on, the bird returned. Every dawn, it sang to the stone until the light became too bright, and at dusk, it returned and sang again until the moon took its place in the sky. The villagers from the nearest hamlet, hearing rumors from hunters and gatherers, began to venture into the forest. They stood at the edges of the clearing, quiet as shadows, listening to the bird's sorrowful songs. Old people wept softly. Children held their breath. Even the animals nearby began to gather. Foxes crouched among the ferns. Deer watched. With wide eyes, squirrels ceased their chatter. It wasn't just the melody that moved them, but the silence that followed each note, as if the stone, unmoving and unmoved for centuries, responded in ways that words could never explain. One day, a young woman named Hannah came to the clearing. She had recently buried her brother, lost to a fever that took him swiftly. She had spoken no words since, her throat locked by grief. When she saw the bird, she knelt, not in worship, but surrender. The bird sang, and something within Hannah cracked, not like broken glass, but like thawing ice. She reached out and touched the stone. It was warm, and in that moment, a memory surged her, brother laughing, running through the fields behind their house, arms wide like wings. She cried then, not just tears of loss, but of connection, as if the bird had bridged the silence between worlds. From that day, she returned, sitting with her eyes closed as the bird sang. She never spoke, but her heart began to bloom again. More people came. Some brought offerings not of incense or coin, but stories. A carved flute, a letter never sent, a lock of hair from a child long gone. They placed them around the stone with trembling hands. The bird watched, but never stopped singing. Seasons passed. Rain fell. Snow blanketed the clearing. The bird never left. In winter, the villagers built a small shelter near the edge of the trees, not for worship, but for warmth, for those who needed to sit, to remember, to breathe. It was open on all sides, a place of listening. One autumn, a scholar arrived. His name was Kenshiro, and he had heard of the singing bird and the lotus stone. A skeptic by nature, he came to disprove the tales. He brought books, instruments, recording devices, but the moment he stepped into the clearing, he dropped them all, for in the air was a stillness too precise, too profound for measurement. He stayed, for weeks, scribbling notes, watching the bird, listening to the villagers, and in time, even he sang not aloud, but within. His skepticism gave way to reverence. He would later write, "It is not the stone that is sacred, nor the bird. It is the silence between them." Then one spring morning, the bird did not sing. It stood atop the stone, wings folded, head low. The villagers waited, hearts anxious. But no song came. Hannah stepped forward, her hands clasped. She spoke, for the first time in 2 years. "What's wrong?" The bird did not move. She climbed slowly, carefully, and cupped the bird in her palms. Its eyes were closed, not in death, but exhaustion. It had sung too long, too hard. She held it close, and for the first time sang to it. Her voice was fragile, thin but steady. She sang of rain, of fields, of laughter. The bird stirred, and slowly it began to hum again. From that day, the villagers took turns. They sang when the bird could not, sometimes with instruments, sometimes with nothing but breath and memory. The stone remained still, but something inside it glowed. Not light, but presence. The forest changed, new trees grew. The soil turned rich. Flowers that had vanished long ago began to bloom again. It was as if the land itself was healing. One evening, a great monk from the northern temple came to visit. He had heard stories and wanted to meditate by the stone. He stayed for 3 days, silent UNMOVING. When he rose, he said, "The bird is the voice of the stone, and the stone is the echo of all who have been forgotten." He placed his prayer, beads on the ground, and walked away without another word. Years passed. The bird grew old. Its feathers grayed. Its wings trembled. But it still sang. One final morning, as the sun rose golden over the trees, the bird sang its last song. It was not sad. It was a song of return, of gratitude, of peace. Then it lay down on the stone, eyes closed, and did not wake. The villagers wept. Hannah, now a teacher to many, buried it beside the stone, wrapping it in a cloth woven with symbols of wind and sky. They planted a tree there, a slender cherry sapling. In time, it grew. Every spring it bloomed with blossoms so pale they looked like whispers. And though the bird was gone, its song remained in the wind that rustled the leaves, in the silence between breaths, in the stone that still warmed. Beneath each hand that touched it, they called it the singing stone now, not because it made sound, but because those who sat beside it always heard exactly what they needed. Story 24. The well that forgot the Eskewi, in a remote village surrounded by amber hills and fields of wheat. There was a well ancient, deep, and rarely used. Its mouth was sealed with moss-covered stones, and vines draped over its edges like unkempt hair. Generations had passed since anyone dared to draw water from it. Not because it was dry, but because of what the elders used to say. The well remembers, they warned. And sometimes it remembers too much. Children dared each other to lean over its edge. Some claimed to hear voices echoing faintly, like whispers from another world. Others swore they saw a pair of eyes blinking in the darkness below. Most dismissed it as folklore, tales meant to keep the curious from falling in. But one girl didn't. Her name was Lynn. She had the look of someone always listening, even when no one was speaking. Her parents were both farmers, quiet people who rose with the sun and rarely smiled. Lynn, however, was different. She wandered the fields barefoot, collected odd stones, and talked to trees. Her questions were the kind that made adults pause. One afternoon, while playing near the edge of the village, Lin sat beneath an old banyan tree that curved protectively over the forgotten well. A wind stirred, and a petal from a wildflower floated down into the darkness below. She crawled toward the opening, brushed aside the vines, and peered in. It was silent. Too silent. "Hello," she whispered. The silence held its breath. Then came a voice, faint and trembling, like a shadow trying to speak. "Do you remember the sky?" Lin blinked. She looked up. The sky was blue, streaked with late summer clouds. "I do," she replied quietly. "It's right there." A pause. "I used to know it," the voice said. "But I've forgotten." "Who are you?" Lin asked, heart thudding. "I was once like you, but I sank. I forgot the wind, the warmth, the stars." Lin shivered, but not from fear. The voice was not cruel. It was ... lonely. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "I fell, chasing my own reflection," the voice answered, "and the world above moved on." Lin didn't understand, but she felt the ache in the words. "Can I help?" she asked. There was another long silence. "Only if you are willing to remember for me." So began a ritual. Every day, Lin returned to the well. She sat beside it, legs crossed, and told stories of clouds shaped like dragons, of rain that kissed her face, of the smell of rice fields in the evening, of songs her mother hummed while cooking. She described the sun, how it felt on skin, the wind, how it danced with her hair, the stars, how they looked like promises, too far to reach, and the well listened. Sometimes it whispered back, asking questions. "Do rivers still run?" "They do." "Do birds still fly?" "They do." "Do people still look up?" Lin paused at that. "Not always," she said. "Some are too busy, some are too tired, but I do. I always look up." One morning, Lin came to the well and found petals floating on the water far below, fresh ones, not from a nearby tree. She gasped. "You remembered something," she whispered. "Yes," the voice replied. "I remembered blossoms. I remembered spring." Their bond deepened, seasons passed. Lin grew taller, her voice deeper, but she never missed a day. The villagers began to notice. They whispered behind her back. "She talks to stones. She's bewitched," but none dared stop her. For though they mocked, they also feared. And part of them ... envied. One stormy night, lightning cracked the sky. Rain fell in sheets. Thunder roared like a mountain waking dot. Lin ran to the well. She threw herself over the edge, clutching the stones, shielding it with her body. "I'm here," she cried. "Don't be afraid." "I'm not," the voice replied. "You taught me the sky, but you're still trapped," she sobbed. "No, I was only forgotten." The storm passed. Dawn arrived like an apology the next morning. Something was different. The vines that had covered the well began to wither, curling back as if retreating. The moss peeled from the stones. Sunlight reached deeper than ever before. Lin leaned over and gasped. The water was glowing, not with magic, but with clarity. With memory, she saw stars in it, trees, clouds, her own reflection, smiling. The voice spoke one last time. "You gave me the sky." And then it faded. From that day, the well became clear. Villagers drew water from it, again not because they had to, but because it tasted like something they had long forgotten. Hope people gathered near it, telling stories to their children. They looked up more often, and Lin, she became a quiet figure, a woman with eyes like dawn. She still visited the well, but she no longer needed to speak aloud, for the well had stopped forgetting, and so had she. The villagers began to call it the well of remembering. No one fell in again, because when you remember the sky, you never truly sink. Story 25. The silence between two BLLs. There was a small monastery nestled in the crook of a mountain pass, surrounded by pine forests that sang with the wind and streams that laughed their way down rocky slopes. The monastery was unadorned, its stones dark with age, its roof patched with care. The only extravagance was its bell single. Silver bells suspended in the highest tower, rung only twice a day, once at dawn, once at dusk. Monks and visitors alike said the bell had the voice of a memory, neither joyful nor sorrowful, but something deeper, like the feeling that comes before a tear or a smile. Among the monks was an old man named Didnt. He was silent most days, speaking only when needed, and even then only after a long pause. His hands were knotted with age, but steady as he copied scripture or swept the courtyards. His back was bent, but his eyes still watched the world as if it was speaking in a language few understood. Didnt had been the bellkeeper for nearly 40 years. His task was simple: climb the narrow spiral stairs at the break of dawn, pull the rope, and let the bell sound across the valley. Then again at dusk, when the shadows lengthened and the world folded into itself. He did this every day without fail. Snow, rain, sickness, none of it deterred him. But what the others did not know was this: Didnt never rang the bell just to mark time. He rang it to remember. Decades earlier, before the robes, before the silence, Didnt had been a father. His son, Bo, had been a child of laughter and questions. Bright eyes, quick feet, the kind of soul that ran toward life with arms wide open. They lived in a village now, lost to fire and time, a place where the river sang louder than the roads, and where people spoke more with their hands than with their mouths. Then came the war. Men were called. Choices were taken. Bo, barely 16, stood one morning with a folded cloth in his hands, the scarf his mother used to tie her hair. "I'll return," he had said, trying to smile, but he never did. The silence that followed was the kind that could drown a man. Didnt wandered after that, through fields, cities, ruins. He stopped speaking, stopped listening. It was only when he reached the mountain monastery, exhausted and lost, that a monk opened the gate and offered him a bowl of soup and a place to sit. Didnt stayed in silence. He found a strange companion, not absence but presence, a space between grief and peace, like the pause between two bells. He did not pray to forget, he prayed to remember without pain. And so, when the head monk offered him the role of bellkeeper, Didnt accepted. Every morning, he rang the bell once for Bo's birth. Every evening, once for his death. And in between, he lived. Years passed. Younger monks came and went, their heads smooth with youth, their hearts eager. One of them, a boy named Liam, often watched Didnt with curiosity. Liam was restless, full of questions, the kind of soul that shook the walls of silence with his wonder. One day, Liam followed Didnt up the tower. "Why do you ring it the same way every time?" he asked as Didnt reached for the rope. Didnt looked at him, not surprised. "Because time doesn't forget," he answered. "But you never vary the rhythm, not even once." Didnt wrapped his hand round the rope and paused. "Would you change the way you breathe?" Liam didn't answer. He watched as Didnt pulled. The bell rang a single, clear note that spilled down the mountainside like water on stone. Liam listened, his heart suddenly still. It sounded like memory, like longing, like love unspoken. That evening, as dusk painted the monastery in soft grey light, Thian rang the bell again, and this time, as the note faded, he turned to Liam and said, "Tomorrow you will ring it." Liam's eyes widened. "Me, yes. It must pass through more than one voice to stay." "Alive," Liam hesitated, "but I don't know what I'm ringing for." Thian placed a hand on his shoulder, light but firm. "You will." One day, the next morning, Liam climbed the tower alone. The bell rope felt heavier than he expected. He pulled. The sound echoed out, less smooth, a little unsure but real. Below. Thian sat beneath the pine tree, listening. He smiled. It was not his memory, but it was memory still. Days passed, then weeks. One morning, the monks found Thian seated beneath the bell tower, unmoving, eyes closed. Breathing slowed like a tide at rest. He had died with a peaceful face. They buried him beneath the pines, where the wind hummed and the sun touched gently. Liam continued as bellkeeper. He rang the bell at dawn and dusk, but not always the same way. Sometimes soft, sometimes strong, sometimes with a pause in between, as if listening for something. People came to the monastery just to hear it. They said the bell spoke differently now, as if it had learned a new language, or perhaps, as Liam once whispered to the forest, the bell had never spoken at all. It had only listened, and what it carried between morning and night, between silence and sound, was the space where all things are remembered, where love, once lost, becomes breath again. And so the bell rang on, one note for every soul ever left behind, and one for those still learning how to remember. If this story touched something within you, perhaps a forgotten memory, a quiet grief, or a longing for stillness, then we invite you to take a moment and reflect. What did the silence between the bells awaken in you? Was it sorrow, love, or something that cannot be named? At the Empty Boat, we offer more than just stories. We offer a place to breathe, to remember, and to heal. If this journey brought you peace or insight, let us know. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read each one with care. Your voice helps guide the next story we tell. If you found meaning here, please consider sharing this video with someone who may need it. And if you'd like to walk further with us through these quiet paths of wisdom and reflection, don't forget to subscribe to The Empty Boat. There's always another story, waiting in the stillness.